The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Victor Crowley rode onto Eliza Whitmore's front porch, tore the envelope from the postman's hands before she could reach it, and read it aloud to the small crowd that had gathered near the general store across the road. "Listen to this," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Cleared his throat with theatrical satisfaction. "A Wyoming rancher wealthy, apparently, has agreed to accept a mail-order bride." He paused. Bride. He looked directly at Eliza, standing in her doorway with her 4-year-old daughter pressed against her leg. Plain Eliza Whitmore, with her little mistake in tow. Laughter moved through the crowd like a cold wind. Eliza didn't flinch. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only made men like Crowley more comfortable. "Give me my letter," she said. He folded it and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "I'm keeping it as a souvenir, for when you come crawling back. Look, if you've ever watched someone take everything from you while smiling, you know exactly what Eliza felt standing there. And if you haven't, stay with this story. Because the woman everyone dismissed as plain, ordinary, and foolish was about to do something that would change every single life she touched. Before we go further, if you're new here, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button if you believe that quiet strength is its own kind of power. Drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really started. Eliza Whitmore had never been described as beautiful, and she had made her peace with that before she was 12 years old. It wasn't that she was plain in any devastating sense. It was more that her 2 younger sisters, Margaret and Clara, had arrived in the world with the kind of faces that made men stop mid-sentence and forget what they were saying. Eliza had arrived first, quieter and sturdier, with her father's wide brow and her mother's work-ruined hands. And the family had more or less assigned her a role from birth. The useful one. Margaret got compliments. Clara got invitations to dances. Eliza got the household ledgers and the job of managing the staff when their mother's nerves became too fragile for the task. She didn't resent her sisters. Not exactly. She had tried that for a while when she was younger, and it had felt like carrying rocks in her chest, heavy and pointless. What she resented, quietly and privately, was the assumption that because she wasn't beautiful, she had nothing else worth having. That assumption had a name in Clover Falls, Missouri. Everyone held it without saying it out loud. It followed her into shops, into Sunday gatherings, into the polite conversations of neighbors who couldn't quite look her in the eye when they spoke. "You're lucky your family has money," those looks said. "Otherwise, what would you have?" What she had was a daughter. Lily had come into the world 4 years before the letter, born of a brief and disastrous involvement with a man named Thomas Graves, who had been charming and well-dressed and completely unwilling to be anyone's father. When Eliza told him about the baby, he had listened carefully, nodded slowly, and then explained with the calm of a man reading a business agreement that this was her problem, not his. Left Clover Falls 3 weeks later. No one seemed particularly surprised. Eliza's father had been furious. Her mother had taken to her bed for 2 weeks. Margaret and Clara had handled the situation by pretending it hadn't happened in public and discussing it endlessly in private. The household had eventually arrived at an arrangement. Lily would be raised in the Whitmore home, acknowledged as Eliza's daughter. No one would speak about Thomas Graves unless they wanted to see the one expression Eliza's father wore when he was genuinely angry. It wasn't a warm arrangement, but it was one. Lily, for her part, grew up understanding something that most 4-year-olds don't have to understand, that she and her mother occupied a different kind of space in the world than the people around them. Not worse necessarily, just different, smaller, more careful. She had her mother's wide eyes and Thomas Graves' dark hair, and she had developed the habit of watching people very closely before she decided whether to trust them. She didn't speak much around strangers. Around Eliza, she talked constantly. Unending commentary on everything she observed. The way the light looked through the kitchen window. What she thought the barn cat was probably thinking. Whether the bread smelled different when it rained. Eliza loved her daughter the way people love the one thing in their life that is wholly and undeniably theirs. Which made what happened with the letter both more complicated and more simple than anyone outside understood. Advertisement had appeared in the back pages of the Clover Falls Courier on a Thursday in March, tucked between a notice about a missing horse and an announcement for a new millinery shop. Margaret had found it first. Gideon Blackwood, rancher, Wyoming Territory. Seeks practical, capable woman for partnership in frontier household. Widow or working woman acceptable. Must be of sound character and willing to meet the demands of Western life. Beautiful face is not required. Good sense is. Margaret had laughed until she had to sit down. She'd shown it to Clara at dinner, and Clara had laughed too, and then they'd looked at each other across the table with the particular telepathy of sisters who have spent their whole lives communicating without words. We should send Eliza, Margaret said. Clara pressed her napkin over her mouth. We absolutely should not. He said he doesn't need a beautiful face. Said he needs good sense. Eliza has good sense. He doesn't want someone with a child, Margaret. He didn't say that. Clara read the advertisement again, more carefully this time. Didn't say that, she admitted. The letter was written as a joke. Margaret composed it at the kitchen table on a Friday afternoon while Eliza was out buying supplies, using her most precise handwriting on Eliza's personal stationery. She described Eliza honestly, perhaps more honestly than Eliza would have described herself, noting her plain appearance, her practical nature, her organizational skills, her lack of social grace, and, at the bottom of the letter, almost as an afterthought, the existence of a 4-year-old daughter named Lily. Margaret sealed the envelope and mailed it before she could think better of it. She expected nothing to come of it. She thought about it at all, that the Wyoming rancher would read the letter, chuckle at the section about the child, and discard it. She did not expect a reply. Gideon Blackwood's response arrived 5 weeks later, addressed to Miss Eliza Whitmore in careful, unhurried handwriting that suggested a man who thought before he wrote. He had read her letter, he said, with more interest than he had read most of the others. He was not, he explained, looking for a woman to impress his neighbors. He had tried that with his first marriage, and the frontier had made that kind of thinking irrelevant very quickly. What he needed was someone capable of managing a complicated household, keeping accurate financial records, and being honest with him when she disagreed with a decision. His ranch, Blackwood Creek, employed 11 men and occupied land that required constant attention. He had a son named Caleb, 7 years old, who had lost his mother 2 years prior, and was struggling in ways that Gideon didn't fully know how to address. Then, the paragraph that Eliza read 3 times. As for your daughter, I've thought about this carefully. Child isn't a liability. Child is a person. And a small person who's already learned something about difficulty is, my experience, more resilient than one who hasn't. If you're willing to come west and see if this arrangement can work for both of us, I'd like to meet you. I make no promises except honesty and fair treatment. I think that's a reasonable starting point. Eliza read the letter at the kitchen table while Lily sat on the floor nearby, attempting to teach the barn cat a trick involving a piece of string. She read it once quickly, once slowly, and then once more with her finger tracing the lines, as if the words might mean something different the third time. They didn't. They meant exactly what they said. She sat with the letter for 3 days before she told anyone. On the 4th day, she told Lily. We might be going on a trip, she said. Lily looked up from the cat. Where, Wyoming, west? Very far. Is it far like grandmother's house far, or far like a really long time in a wagon far? A really long time in a wagon far. Lily considered this with her customary seriousness. Is there a barn? I believe so. Then I'll go, Lily said, and returned to the cat. Eliza told her parents on a Sunday. Her father's reaction was quiet, which was worse than anger. Sat in his chair by the window for a long time without speaking. Got looking out at the street. And then he said, understand what you'd be giving up. What am I giving up exactly? Eliza asked. He didn't have a good answer for that. What he meant, and what he couldn't say, was the safety of this house, protection of the Whitmore name, the comfortable smallness of a life where everyone knew their place and stayed there. What he didn't say, because he'd never quite admitted it even to himself, was, I don't know what happens to you and that child if you go. And I don't know what happens to you and that child if you stay. Her mother cried. Her mother had a gift for crying in a way that made her tears feel like an accusation, and Eliza sat through 15 minutes of it with her hands folded in her lap before her mother exhausted herself and went to lie down. Margaret and Clara had the grace to look slightly ashamed when Eliza confronted them about the letter. We didn't think he'd actually write back, Margaret said. Obviously, Eliza said, you're not actually going to go. I'm actually going to go. Clara made a small sound of disbelief. Eliza, you don't know this man. I know what he wrote. Letters lie. So does everyone else, Eliza said. At least he signed his name to it. She wrote back to Gideon Blackwood that evening. She told him that she was who the letter described: practical, plain, and in possession of one small daughter who was more resilient than most adults she knew. She told him she could manage accounts and households and difficult situations with a reasonable degree of competence. She told him she would not pretend to be more than she was, and she expected the same courtesy in return. She told him she would come west. Preparations took 3 weeks, which was not enough time by any reasonable measure, and was the only time she had. There was a great deal to organize. Eliza was constitutionally incapable of doing anything halfway, a trait her mother had always found exhausting, and which was about to become genuinely useful. She arranged the transport of 2 trunks, one for practical necessities, one for the books and records she intended to maintain, packed Lily's things with the same methodical care. Wren wrote a list of what she would need to learn about Wyoming before she arrived. The list was long: winter temperatures, water availability, structure of a working cattle operation, the specific legal landscape of the Wyoming Territory regarding property rights and women's standing. Spent an afternoon in the Clover Falls Library and emerged with more questions than she'd arrived with, which she considered a good sign. Clover Falls had opinions about her departure. People didn't say things directly. This was Missouri in 1885. Non-directness was considered somewhat vulgar, but she heard enough sideways comments in the general store and the millinery and at the post office to understand what people thought. She was desperate, that she was foolish, that no wealthy rancher was going to keep a plain woman with another man's child once he actually saw her. She was making the second biggest mistake of her life, the first having been Lily's father. Eliza had learned to sort comments into 2 categories, ones that deserved a response and ones that deserved silence. Most of what she heard about her departure fell into the second category. The morning she left, her father shook her hand. It was the most affectionate thing he knew how to do, and Eliza took it for what it was. Her mother kissed Lily on the forehead and didn't look at Eliza. Margaret and Clara stood on the porch together and watched her load the wagon, and Margaret, to her credit, walked down at the last moment and said, "I'm sorry about the letter." Eliza looked at her sister for a moment. "I'm not," she said. She meant it. The journey west took 11 days by train and then 2 more by wagon, which gave Eliza a great deal of time to reconsider nearly every decision she had made in the last 6 weeks. She was very good at reconsidering decisions. It was a skill that, in certain situations, could become a liability. Lily, however, was not a reconsidering kind of person. She sat pressed against the train window for hours at a stretch, narrating what she saw to Eliza in a continuous low murmur: Gun the river, different colors of grass, a man who was sleeping in a very undignified position 2 seats ahead, a hawk sitting on a fence post with what Lily described as a very serious expression. She slept deeply and ate her meals with concentration and woke up each morning apparently refreshed in a way that made Eliza feel vaguely envious. "Are you nervous?" Eliza asked her on the second to last day, somewhere in the flatlands before Wyoming. Lily thought about it. What if the boy doesn't want us there? Eliza had been thinking about the boy Caleb since the first letter. 7-year-old who had lost his mother was a specific kind of complicated that she hadn't fully worked out how to approach. "I think we go slowly," she said. "We don't push. We just show up and do what needs doing and let him decide what he thinks. What if he hates us? Then we make sure we're not making his life worse, and we give him time." Lily was quiet for a moment. "What if the rancher man is mean? Then we figure out what to do about that. What if he's mean like Mr. Crowley?" Eliza looked at her daughter. Lily had witnessed the incident on the porch 3 days before they left Victor Crowley reading the letter aloud, the laughter, the crowd. She hadn't mentioned it until now. "Victor Crowley is a particular kind of person," Eliza said carefully. "Most people aren't like that. But some are, yes. Some are. So how do you know the rancher man isn't?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was she didn't know. She had a letter. She had careful handwriting and a paragraph about Lily that had struck her as genuinely thoughtful, but people could write things they didn't mean. She knew that better than most. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I'm good at reading people pretty quickly, and if I'm wrong, we figure it out." Lily looked at her mother with the particular steady gaze she reserved for things she was taking seriously. "Okay," she said, and then, apparently satisfied, she turned back to the window. The landscape outside had begun changing in the last hour, becoming something harder and bigger and more demanding of attention. Sky was enormous in a way that felt almost aggressive, more sky than Eliza had ever seen in one place, and the land beneath it stretched toward distances that made Missouri's gentle hills feel like a pleasant dream. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass and watched Wyoming arrive. Gideon Blackwood was waiting at the station. Eliza had constructed a vague image of him, from the letters somewhere between a rough frontier type and the businesslike tone of his writing, and the actual man was neither of those things, and somehow both of them. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that people develop when they spend most of their time outdoors and have learned not to waste energy. His face was weathered in a way that made it difficult to guess his age, exactly somewhere between 35 and 45, she thought, though she'd narrow that down later. He was holding his hat in both hands when he saw them step off the train, which struck her as an oddly formal gesture for a man who otherwise looked like he'd never done a formal thing in his life. Guys went to Lily first, not in the assessing, skeptical way she'd braced herself for, just noticing. "Taking her in, Miss Whitmore," he said. Mr. Blackwood, a pause. "This is Lily," Eliza said. Crouched down, which put him at eye level with Lily, who was studying him with her full analytical attention. "I've heard about you," he said. Lily tilted her head. "My mother said there's a barn." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. "There is, with horses?" "7 of them." Lily looked at Eliza with an expression that very clearly communicated, "I've made my decision." Eliza pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. Gideon straightened and met her eyes. They looked at each other for a moment, with the frank, slightly uncomfortable assessment of two strangers who have agreed to a very significant arrangement on the basis of handwritten letters. "Wagon's this way," he said. "All right," she said. Walked toward it, Lily between them, the Wyoming wind coming down from somewhere cold and enormous and smelling of distance. Eliza did not know, standing in that station, whether this was going to be the bravest thing she had ever done or the most spectacular mistake of her life. She suspected it might be both, and she had made her peace with that somewhere in the flatlands of Nebraska. What she did know was that when Gideon Blackwood had looked at her daughter, he hadn't looked away. In Eliza Whitmore's experience, that counted for something. Blackwood Creek Ranch was 2 hours from the station by wagon, and it was on that drive that Eliza began to understand the scale of what she had agreed to. The land was immense in the way that required adjustment, not just of the eyes, but of something deeper, some internal measure of proportion that had been calibrated to Missouri and now needed recalibrating entirely. There were no gentle boundaries here, no hedgerows or neighborly fences to create the comfortable illusion that the world was manageable. Just sky and land and the distant suggestion of mountains, cold and indifferent and extraordinary. The ranch itself, when they reached it, was not what she'd imagined either. She'd built up something in her mind, not a grand house, but something solid and well-maintained, the kind of place that announced itself. What she found instead was a collection of buildings that had been built for function and extended as needed and repaired when necessary, without much attention to how the whole picture looked. It was honest in the way that only very busy places are honest. Nobody had had time to pretend. A man named Holt, who served as something between a foreman and a general manager of everything, Gideon didn't have time to attend to personally, met them at the main house. He was in his 50s, with a gray beard and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades staring into the sun, and he looked at Eliza with a directness that she appreciated even when it felt like being evaluated. "This is Eliza Whitmore," Gideon said. Holt nodded, looked at Lily. "And this one?" Lily said. "Talk for yourself," Holt said, which sounded like a test. "Yes," Lily said. He seemed to find this satisfactory. He showed Eliza the house without commentary, letting the rooms speak for themselves, which they did. A kitchen that was organized but understocked, a sitting room that no one appeared to have sat in recently, dining area where the evidence of 11 working men passing through was extremely visible. The account's ledger he handed over at the end of the tour was the most revealing thing of all, not because it was badly kept, because it showed the precise point at which a competent man had simply run out of hours in the day and started recording things in increasingly abbreviated form. "There's a room for you and the girl," Holt said. 2 beds. "There's a room further down, for when—" He stopped himself. "For when we determine whether a more permanent arrangement makes sense," Eliza supplied. Looked at her with slightly more respect. Yeah, Gideon had disappeared while Holt showed her around, which she didn't take personally. She understood from the letter that this was a man who demonstrated things through action rather than conversation, and who would not waste time on elaborate social performances. She found out why he'd disappeared when Holt led her past a closed door on the second floor and paused. "Boy's in there," Holt said quietly. "Caleb." He's another pause, a different kind. "He's having a hard go of it. How long has it been since his mother died?" Eliza asked. 2 years come April. She looked at the door. Behind it, complete silence, the specific, cultivated silence of a child who has learned to be very still and very quiet and make himself difficult to notice. She didn't knock. Not yet. She filed it away and kept walking. That night, after Lily was asleep, Gideon sat across the kitchen table from Eliza with 2 cups of coffee between them, and they had the most honest conversation she'd had with another adult in approximately 4 years. He told her the truth about the ranch, the debts from an equipment failure the previous spring, the supplier relationship that had gone strange in ways he hadn't fully investigated, seasonal challenges that left the operation vulnerable in ways he hadn't wanted to admit in a letter to a stranger. Told him the truth about herself, what she was capable of, what she wasn't, what she expected in return for her work, and the fact that Lily was not a problem to be managed, but a child who deserved to be treated as such. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was more than most men could say for themselves. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. He seemed to be looking for the right word. "Desperate." "I'm not desperate," Eliza said. "I'm practical." "There's a difference." He looked at her across the table. "Yeah," he said. "There is." She went to bed that night in the room with 2 beds and her sleeping daughter. She lay in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a Wyoming night wind, cattle, distant bark of something she couldn't name, and thought about the supplier relationship that had gone strange. She thought about it for a long time before she fell asleep. Something in the numbers wasn't right. She was going to find out what. The numbers had been bothering her for 3 days before she finally said anything about it. Eliza had spent those 3 days doing what she always did when she was working something out. She kept her hands busy and her mouth shut and let her mind run the problem on its own schedule. She reorganized the kitchen stores on the first day, which was genuinely necessary, and also gave her an excuse to be present in the heart of the house without anyone asking her what she was doing. She walked the nearest pastures on the second day, Lily beside her, asking questions about the cattle operation that were practical enough that Holt answered them straight and long enough that she got a clear picture of how the ranch actually functioned from the ground up. On the third day, she sat down with the accounts ledger again, not the abbreviated current one, but the full records going back 18 months, which she'd found in a wooden box under Gideon's desk, after asking his permission and receiving a slightly distracted nod from a man who was already thinking about something else. What she found wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about financial dishonesty. Done well, it was never dramatic. It was quiet. It was a series of small adjustments. Amounts shifted just slightly left of where they should be. Invoices from a supplier called Harmon & Dale that didn't quite correspond to the quantities of goods actually delivered. Pattern so gradual and consistent that it could have looked like nothing more than clerical imprecision if you weren't specifically looking for it. Eliza had grown up keeping her family's household accounts, and she had a memory for numbers the way some people had a memory for faces. Once she saw a figure. It stayed with her. Discrepancies irritated her the way a splinter irritates a finger small. Persistent. Impossible to ignore. She brought it to Gideon on a Thursday evening, after supper, after Lily was in bed, and she set the ledger open on the table between them and put her finger on the first entry she'd circled in pencil. "This delivery from Harmon & Dale in September," she said. "Recorded as 42 units of winter feed supplement at $4 per unit." Gideon looked at it. "That's what I paid. Holt told me yesterday that the storage shed holds 35 units maximum. He said it's always held 35 maximum because of the roof support on the east side." Pause. "He also said," Eliza continued, keeping her voice neutral, "that he remembered that particular delivery because the driver was an hour late and he'd had to rearrange the afternoon's work to accommodate it. Said they unloaded 31 units. Gideon was very still. "That's 11 units you paid for that were either never delivered or that someone recorded incorrectly," Eliza said. $4 each. That's $44. That's one instance in September. I've found 17 similar instances across the last 18 months. She'd done the arithmetic 3 times to make sure. She told him the number. He stared at the ledger. His jaw worked once, the way a man's jaw works when he's deciding between several things he wants to say, and none of them are entirely suitable. Harmon and Dale have been supplying this ranch for 6 years, he said finally. I know, Dale Harmon has stopped. Started again. I've had supper at that man's table. I know that too. She let him sit with it for a moment. I'm not saying it's Dale Harmon personally. It could be someone working for him. Could be a billing error on their end, though the consistency makes that unlikely. But I think you need to know. He looked at her then. Dee really looked at her, in the way he hadn't quite managed since she'd arrived, not assessing, not cautious, just direct. You found this in 3 days. The pattern's not subtle if you're looking at the full picture. I haven't been looking at the full picture, he said. It wasn't quite an admission of fault. It was something more honest than that, the acknowledgement of a man who had simply had too many things to look at and had made choices about which ones required his attention. You've been running a cattle operation with 11 men and a ranch this size, Eliza said. I'm looking at paper. It's different work. He was quiet for a moment. What do you think I should do? She had an answer ready, because she'd been thinking about it for 2 days. Don't confront Harmon yet. Get the delivery records from Holt, anything he noted down about what actually arrived. Cross-reference it against the invoices. If the pattern holds across multiple deliveries, you'll have documentation. Then you decide whether this is a legal matter or a business separation. Gideon looked at the ledger again. Then he closed it, which she recognized as his way of ending the conversation on a topic so that he could think about it privately. All right, he said. She got up to take her coffee cup to the kitchen. Eliza. She stopped. Thank you, he said. It came out slightly awkward, like a man who meant it more than he was comfortable showing. It's what I'm here for, she said. And went to the kitchen. Stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the Wyoming dark and thinking that the word here had started to feel slightly different than it had on the train. Caleb Blackwood made his first real appearance in the household on a Sunday. He'd been present before. Technically, Eliza had seen him at meals, a serious-faced boy with his father's build, and an expression of permanent wariness that she recognized from somewhere deep in her own childhood memory. Sat at the table and ate and answered direct questions with 1 or 2 words and excused himself as quickly as manners allowed. He did not look at Lily. He did not look at Eliza. He looked at his plate and the window and occasionally at his father with the complicated expression of a child who loves someone and has also learned to be terrified of losing them. Lily, characteristically, had not attempted to force anything. She ate her meals and watched Caleb with her quiet, analytical gaze and said nothing directed at him specifically. Eliza suspected she was running the same calculation. This was a boy who needed time, and time was the only thing they had to give. On Sunday, Holt sent most of the ranch hands out for an extended fence check on the north pasture. The main house was quieter than usual, and Lily wandered out to the barn before anyone noticed. Eliza noticed 20 minutes later and went to find her. She stopped at the barn doorway, because the scene inside was the kind of thing that stops you. Caleb was in the barn. He'd apparently come out on his own errand and found Lily standing in front of a bay mare named Tessie, explaining something to the horse in a low, concentrated voice. Caleb was standing 6 feet back, not moving, watching Lily with an expression that was mostly confusion and also, round the edges, something that might have been reluctant interest. She doesn't mind people talking to her, Lily was telling Tessie. She looks like she's listening. Do you think she understands the words or just the sound? Sound, Caleb said. Lily looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who had spoken without meaning to. How do you know? Lily asked. A pause. My mother used to say horses are they're like people who are very good at listening but can't talk back. You feel what you mean, not what you say. Lily considered this seriously. That's better than words sometimes. Something happened in Caleb's face that Eliza couldn't fully describe from the doorway, except that it was the first time she'd seen anything shift in there since she'd arrived. Moved half a step closer to the horse. To Lily, technically. Eliza backed away from the doorway and returned to the house. She told no one. She put it somewhere careful inside her and kept it there. First person in town who was genuinely unpleasant to her face was a woman named Barbara Hennessy, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store in the nearest town, a place called Cutter's Run, 12 miles east of the ranch, and who seemed to have taken Eliza's arrival as a personal commentary on the standards of Wyoming women generally. Eliza had driven into Cutter's Run with Holt to arrange resupply, which was a task she'd taken over at Gideon's request after she'd identified that the current arrangement was costing the ranch more than it needed to. She had a list and a budget and a clear sense of what she was there for, which was more than could be said for the welcome she received. Barbara Hennessy looked at Eliza over the counter with the focused hostility of a woman who had decided her opinion before introductions were complete. She looked at the list Eliza presented. She looked at Eliza again. "You're the one from Missouri," she said. "Yes," Eliza said. "Mail order one, yes. With the child. My daughter's name is Lily." Barbara's mouth did something complicated. "I'm sure she's very nice." The tone made clear that this was not a compliment. "You know, Gideon Blackwood's been one of the most respected men in this county for 15 years. "I'm aware," Eliza said pleasantly. "His first wife was a fine woman. Grew up here. Everyone knew her, I'm sure she was. Could I get 200 pounds of flour, please?" The slight that followed was small enough to be deniable a short measurement on the salt, a flour grade that was technically within the range requested but represented the cheaper end. A manner of handing over the receipt that made clear she was doing Eliza a reluctant favor by conducting business with her at all. Eliza accepted everything with even courtesy and said nothing about any of it. In the wagon on the way home, Holt said, "Listen, without looking at her, she's like that with everyone new." "I noticed," Eliza said. "She'll either come around or she won't. Either way, I need flour." He glanced at her sideways. Could see, without looking directly, that he was revising something. Women of Cutter's Run held their own opinions about Eliza's arrival, and most of those opinions were a degree warmer than Barbara Hennessy's, which set the bar extremely low. They were curious, primarily. She was an anomaly, a mail-order bride who had arrived with a child, and who was apparently managing the Blackwood accounts, and who hadn't, as of the second week, done anything visibly foolish. Watched her when she came to town. They commented to each other at the level of careful social observation. Few of them nodded when she passed. It wasn't welcome. It wasn't the worst thing either. The worst thing came from a different direction entirely. His name was Victor Crowley, and he had been circling Blackwood Creek Ranch for 2 years. Eliza didn't know this at first. She knew him only as the man who had been at the train station in Cutter's Run on her second week, the man who had stopped Gideon to shake his hand with a grip that lasted slightly too long, who had looked at Eliza with a kind of pleasant assessment that had all the warmth of someone calculating the weight of livestock. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the frontier sense, good quality coat, boots that cost money, etc. He moved with the ease of a man who had never been in a room where he didn't have the upper hand. "So this is the Missouri bride," he said, still looking at her. "Eliza Whitmore," she said. "Victor Crowley." He shook her hand. Grip was perfectly calibrated, firm enough to demonstrate authority, brief enough to suggest he had more important places to be. "Gideon, you've been holding out on us." "I expected." A pause with a small smile at the end of it. "Well, I expected something more." He said it lightly. Kind of light that is designed to slip past defenses because it sounds like nothing. Gideon's face went briefly taut. "Victor, what brings you to town?" "Business. Always business." Crowley smiled again at Eliza this time. "I hope you find Wyoming agreeable, Miss Whitmore. It can be very unforgiving to people who aren't prepared for it." Tipped his hat and walked away. "Who is he?" Eliza asked when he was out of earshot. Gideon watched him go. "Victor Crowley. He owns the Crowley Consolidated Land Office. Half the mineral surveys in this county go through his company." "Wants your land," Eliza said. Gideon looked at her. "He's been making offers for 3 years, and you've been saying no. Water rights on this property feed 12 smaller operations downstream. Crowley gets the land, he controls the water. The smaller operations either pay his rates or collapse." Eliza looked after the diminishing figure of Victor Crowley moving down the main street of Cutter's Run with the comfortable gait of a man who believed the world would eventually arrange itself to his satisfaction. Said, "I expected something more," she said. "Don't take that personally." "I'm not taking it personally, I'm filing it away." She turned back to the wagon. "Expected someone impressive. Someone he'd have to work around. He's decided I'm not that." Gideon frowned. "That's useful," she said. "People who underestimate you always give you more room than people who don't." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one he wore when she'd said something that landed somewhere he hadn't expected. He climbed up to the wagon seat, and they drove home. First genuine crisis came in the 4th week. It began with a horse, which was fitting for a cattle ranch, and it escalated in the way that things escalate when you have 11 men, an operation running on thin margins. One very serious 7-year-old boy who had stopped following his father's instructions long enough to make a decision that nearly cost him everything. Caleb had been riding since before he could walk properly, by all accounts. He knew the horses the way a person knows the rooms of the house they grew up in by feel, in the dark, without needing to think about it. So when one of the mares, a young roan named Pepper, barely broken, got loose from the east paddock in the early morning, Caleb was the one who saw her from the second-floor window. Caleb was the one who went after her, alone, before anyone else was properly awake. Eliza was awake. She was always awake before the household, old habit. She'd been waking before dawn since she was 12 and responsible for getting the kitchen fires going before the staff arrived. She was in the kitchen when she heard the paddock gate latch. She looked out the window and saw the small figure of Caleb moving across the frost-stiff grass toward the eastern pasture boundary, with a lead rope in his hand and the particular determined stride of a child who has not yet fully calculated the risk of what he's doing. Gaka. She stood at the window for 3 seconds, which was how long it took her to weigh the situation and make a decision, and then she pulled her coat off the peg and went after him. She caught up to him at the fence line, where Pepper had stopped to investigate something in the brush, with the casual authority of an animal that knows it has the upper hand. "Caleb," she said, keeping her voice low and even. Spun around. His face ran through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, irritation, something that might have been relief and which he quickly suppressed. "I've got her," he said. "I know you do, but I could use an extra pair of hands." Looked at her with the specific suspicion of a child who has been managed before and doesn't like the feeling. "Don't know horses." "Not well," she agreed. "Better than nothing, though." He hesitated. Pepper had moved another few feet into the brush, unconcerned. "She responds to her name and pressure from the left," Caleb said, which was the longest sentence he'd directed at her since she'd arrived. "If you go wide around her right side, she'll turn toward the fence." "Show me," Eliza said. He showed her. It took 12 minutes and required more patience than Eliza had expected, because Pepper was genuinely uninterested in cooperation, and the frost on the grass made footing unreliable. And at one point, Eliza went down on one knee with considerably more impact than she would have chosen. They got the rope on the mare together, and they walked her back to the paddock together. And the whole time Caleb kept up a low, continuous commentary on what Pepper was doing and why and what it meant, voice of someone who has absorbed a great deal of knowledge and has no one to tell it to. At the paddock gate, after Pepper was secured, and they were both standing in the cold morning air, with their breath making small clouds, Caleb looked at Eliza's knee. She'd torn the fabric of her work skirt going down. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "A little," she said. She could have said no, but she'd decided from the beginning that she wasn't going to lie to this boy about small things. He'd had enough of that already. She suspected the careful untruths adults tell children to make difficult situations seem manageable. He looked at the torn fabric and then looked away. She wouldn't have hurt me," he said, and it had the sound of something he'd been thinking for a while. "I knew what I was doing." "I know," Eliza said. "So why did you come after me?" She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated, because she'd seen a child moving alone toward something risky, and her body had moved before her brain finished the calculation. Because that was what you did when you were responsible for someone. Because Lily was sleeping, and Gideon hadn't woken yet, and there was nobody else. Complicated, honest answer wasn't what he was asking. "Because you were handling something alone that was easier with 2 people, she said. Caleb thought about this. He had his father's quality of stillness, the same capacity to sit inside a thought and work it from multiple sides before deciding what to do with it. "I do things alone a lot," he said. "I know," Eliza said again. "My dad's busy." "He is. He's not ignoring me on purpose," said quickly, defensively, the reflex of a child who has felt abandoned and doesn't want to admit it because admitting it would make it real. "I know that too," Eliza said. Caleb looked at her sideways. "You know a lot." "Not really. I just pay attention." It was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back toward the house, and she fell into step beside him, and they walked back across the frost-stiff grass in a silence that was less hostile than any silence between them had been before. Kitchen door, he stopped. He didn't look at her. "Flour barrel's almost empty," he said. "Holt usually doesn't notice until it's too late." Then he went inside. Eliza stood at the kitchen door for a moment in the cold morning air. Then she followed him in and checked the flour barrel, and it was nearly empty, and she added it to the supply list she kept folded in her apron pocket. She didn't say anything to Gideon about the morning. She figured Caleb would tell him or he wouldn't, and either way it wasn't her story to carry. Gideon found out. Not from Caleb, and not from Eliza, but from one of the hands who'd seen them crossing the pasture from the bunkhouse window at the time he was getting dressed for the day's work. He mentioned it to Holt with the uncomplicated directness of a working man who hadn't understood there was anything complicated about it. And Holt told Gideon that evening, in the way that men like Holt communicated things sideways, in passing, the careful neutrality of someone who has formed an opinion, but isn't going to offer it without being asked. Gideon came to find Eliza after supper. She was in the small room off the kitchen that she'd set up as a working space, with the accounts ledger and the delivery records she was cross-referencing, and a lamp that was burning lower than she'd realized. Stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. "Holt told me about Pepper this morning," he said. "She got through the east gate latch," Eliza said. "You might want Holt to look at the mechanism. It's been giving way." Caleb was alone when he went after her. He had it handled. Gideon came into the room and sat down across from her, which wasn't something he did often in her workspace. She kept her attention on the ledger for another moment, then looked up. Expression was harder to read than usual. Not angry. Something more complicated. "He shouldn't have been out there alone," Gideon said. "No, but he was, and he knew what he was doing, and he got her back." She paused. "He's good with horses." "I know he is. He knows everything about that mare, her responses. What pressures work, what doesn't. Gave me precise instructions for flanking her from the right, so she'd turn back toward the fence." He was right. Gideon was quiet. "He talks a lot," Eliza said, "when he's talking about something he knows well." Another silence, longer than the last. She recognized the weight of what was sitting between them, not a disagreement, exactly, but something Gideon was working through and hadn't arrived at yet. "Doesn't talk to me much anymore," Gideon said finally. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her since the night with the coffee cups. She treated it with the same care she would have given an injured thing, something you don't move too fast around. "He's afraid," she said simply. "He loves you, and he's afraid of losing you, and the easiest way to manage that fear is to need you a little less. So he goes out alone, so he handles things himself. So he doesn't," she stopped herself. "So he doesn't get too attached," Gideon said. "Yes." The kitchen clock counted out a long stretch of quiet. "How do you know that?" Gideon asked. She thought about Lily. About a 4-year-old who had watched her father leave and had processed that fact in her own small, concentrated way by paying extremely careful attention to everyone and everything around her, by holding her trust until it was earned, by making herself useful before she made herself vulnerable, by learning to be resilient before she'd learned to be carefree. "I've seen it before," she said. Gideon looked at her. The lamp between them was burning very low now, and in its diminished light she could see the particular tiredness in his face, not the tiredness of a man who needed sleep, but of a man carrying something that sleep couldn't touch. "I don't know how to reach him anymore," he said, after his mother. He stopped, shook his head slightly, not in negation, but in the way people shake their heads when they've run into the limit of what language can do. "I tried, I keep trying, but every time I get close, he moves," Eliza said. "Yeah, don't chase him," she said. "Be somewhere he can find you. There's a difference." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the table. "Got good instincts. I've got a daughter who taught me," she said. "The hard way mostly." He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. He stood up and looked at the nearly dead lamp. "You need more oil." "I know. I was going to get it before the ledger got interesting." He went and got the oil without being asked, refilled the lamp, and went to bed without saying anything else. Which was, Eliza was learning, very much Gideon Blackwood's way, the action in place of the word. The thing done instead of the thing said. She sat for another hour with the delivery records and confirmed what she'd suspected since the third day. It wasn't a billing error. Someone was stealing from Blackwood Creek Ranch, and they had been for at least 18 months, and the amounts were significant enough to have contributed directly to the financial pressure Gideon had described on the first night. She set down her pencil and rubbed her eyes, and thought about Dale Harmon and his invoices. She thought about Victor Crowley moving down the main street of Cutter's Run with his carefully calibrated grip, and his comment about expecting something more. She thought about the way those two things sat in her mind uncomfortably close to each other. She didn't have proof of a connection yet. She was meticulous enough not to assume one. But she was going to find out. It was Lily who broke Caleb open in the end. Not deliberately. Lily was not the kind of child who set out to accomplish things through strategy. What she did was simpler. She found something Caleb cared about and asked him genuine questions about it, and then listened to the answers the way she listened to most things, with her whole attention. which was a rarer gift than most people understood. The thing she found was birds. Caleb had been keeping a record, a private one, in a school exercise book he'd clearly repurposed for the purpose of every bird he'd observed on the ranch property. He'd started it the winter after his mother died, which was something Eliza suspected he hadn't told anyone and which she'd figured out from the dates on the first entries. Gah. It was meticulous in the way that children's projects are meticulous when they're driven by something deeper than interest, the handwriting careful, the observations detailed, small sketches in the margins made by someone who was trying hard to get the thing right. Lily found the book on the windowsill of the sitting room, where Caleb had left it when he was called away for supper. She was sitting with it in her lap, studying the sketches, when Caleb came back into the room. He froze. Lily looked up. "Did you draw these?" "That's mine," he said, voice tight. "I know, I wasn't trying to. I just found it there." She held it out immediately. "Sorry." He took it, looked at her. She had that expression she wore when she was waiting to see what a person would do, not anxious, just watching. "The hawk one," she said carefully. "The big one on the third page. Is that the one that sits on the fence by the north pasture in the mornings?" The long pause. "Ferruginous hawk," Caleb said stiffly. "They winter here sometimes." He was there this morning. He looked the same as the drawing. Something in Caleb's posture shifted, not much, just slightly. The book came down a few inches from where he'd been holding it against his chest. "She," he said. "The females are bigger." "She," Lily said, accepting the correction without hesitation. Another pause. Caleb looked at the book in his hands. Then he sat down on the other end of the window seat from Lily, not close, but the same piece of furniture, and opened it to the hawk page. "Marking on the belly is how you tell," he said, and his voice had shifted into the register. Eliza had heard at the horse paddock, knowledgeable, absorbed, talking to someone he'd temporarily stopped being guarded with. Lily leaned in to look. Eliza had been in the hallway. She kept walking. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window and looked out at the Wyoming afternoon, and her chest felt full of something she didn't have a name for. Exactly. Not happiness, though it was related to that. Something more like gratitude. Specific, aching kind. The Harmon and Dale situation came to a head on a cold Tuesday in early November. Gideon had done what Eliza suggested. He'd gotten the delivery records from Holt, cross-referenced them carefully, found the patterns she'd identified, and several additional instances she'd missed because she hadn't had access to Holt's personal notes. Together, they were looking at 23 discrepancies over 19 months, amounting to a number that made Gideon go very still in the way he went still when he was genuinely angry. He'd wanted to ride directly to the Harmon warehouse in Cutter's Run. Eliza had talked him out of it. If you go in there angry, he denies everything and adjusts his records before you can get anyone to look at them, she said. You need a witness. You need the territorial auditor, or someone equivalent, to verify the delivery records independently. It takes time. It takes 2 weeks. That's less time than a lawsuit. Meh. He looked at her across the kitchen table, with the expression of a man who was making a significant effort to be patient with reasonable advice that was getting in the way of what he wanted to do. She recognized the expression. It was, she suspected, an expression she wore occasionally herself. 2 weeks, he said. I can have everything organized for the auditor's review by the end of this week, she said. Documentation is thorough. He exhaled. All right. Done, Gideon. She waited until he looked at her. Don't say anything to anyone in town yet, including people you trust. We don't know how far this goes, and if word gets back to Harmon that you're looking into his books. He'll run, Gideon said, or he'll destroy the records, and then you have nothing. He nodded slowly. The anger hadn't gone anywhere. She could see it sitting behind his eyes, patient and cold, but he'd gotten it under control, which was all that was required right now. Territorial auditor's name was Amos Pruitt, and he arrived 11 days later on a Thursday morning, precise little man in a gray coat who looked at the documentation. Eliza had prepared with the focused attention of someone who appreciated thoroughness. He spent 2 days cross-referencing records, at the end of which he produced a finding that confirmed 21 of the 23 discrepancies and recommended formal investigation. It was the recommendation they needed. What happened next? The confrontation with Dale Harmon, the discovery that it wasn't Dale Harmon personally, but his billing clerk, a man named Reg Fowler, who had been quietly supplementing his wages for nearly 2 years, took another 2 weeks and several conversations that Eliza was not present for. When it was resolved, Gideon recovered a significant portion of what had been taken, and Reg Fowler left Cut Run in circumstances that were not discussed in polite company. The evening it was all settled, Gideon came home and sat down at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a long time. Lily was in bed. The house was quiet. I kept thinking about how long it went on, he said finally. Right under my nose. You were running a ranch, Eliza said. Can't see everything. That's not a good enough answer. No, she agreed. It isn't. But it's the true one. She thought for a moment. The better answer is that you see it now and you know what to look for. That's what you do with a mistake. You make it harder to happen again. He looked at his hands on the table. You're very practical about failure. I've had a lot of practice, she said. He almost laughed. Quite. But there was something in his face when he looked up at her that had shifted in the last few weeks. Something that was less the careful distance of a man managing a professional arrangement and more the expression of a person who had started to see someone clearly. She noticed it and filed it away, the way she filed away most things she wasn't ready to act on yet. Outside, the November wind moved through the Wyoming dark, and inside the Blackwood Creek kitchen, the lamp burned steadily. Not for the first time since she'd arrived, Eliza Whitmore thought about the word home without immediately adding the qualifier that it didn't quite apply to her. She wasn't sure exactly when that had started to change, but it had. She was in the records room, the small space she'd fully claimed as her workspace by now, with the ledger and the files and the supply lists and the correspondence she managed on Gideon's behalf when she found the second problem. It was buried deeper than the first one. The Harmon billing discrepancies had been sloppy, the work of a man who was careful enough to keep amounts small, but not careful enough to maintain genuine consistency. This was different. This was someone who understood legal language. Contract, or rather it was a copy of a contract, filed among routine ranch paperwork in a way that suggested someone had wanted it accessible without wanting it noticed. Contract was between a land brokerage called Consolidated Western Holdings and a party identified only as B. CR, which Eliza understood almost immediately to stand for Blackwood Creek Ranch. It was dated 14 months prior. It described an option agreement, not a sale, but an option on approximately 40% of the ranch's water right territory, exercisable within a period of 3 years from the signing date. Signature at the bottom was not Gideon's. She read the document 3 times in the lamplight, her coffee going cold beside her, her pencil in her hand and not moving. Consolidated Western Holdings was a name she had heard once before, mentioned briefly in a conversation in Cutter's Run, that she hadn't thought much about at the time. She thought about it now. She thought about Victor Crowley's land office and the way he'd been making offers on Blackwood Creek for 3 years, and the pleasant assessment in his eyes when he'd looked at her at the train station. She sat with the document for a long time before she took it to Gideon. She waited until the house was quiet and Lily was long asleep and Caleb had retreated to his room, and then she went and knocked on Gideon's study door and put the contract on his desk and stepped back and watched his face while he read it. She had learned by then to read Gideon's face accurately. She watched the careful frown of a man reading something complicated turn into the stillness of a man understanding something terrible. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Filed between the October supply invoices and the equipment maintenance records from last spring. Someone put it there." Yes, he read it again. His jaw was working. "That signature isn't mine." "I know. It looks like mine." "I know that too." He set the paper down very carefully. "This is real. If this option is enforceable, Crowley can exercise it in 22 months. He'd control the water rights for the entirety of the lower pasture. Every downstream operation that depends on this water would have to deal with him directly. And I signed nothing, no. But someone signed your name." He looked at her. His eyes were very steady in the way that calm men's eyes go steady when they are not, in fact, calm. "Crowley," he said. "It's linked to his operation, yes. We need to prove it carefully, Eliza." His voice was quiet. "This is fraud. This is a forged contract that would effectively steal 40% of this ranch's water sovereignty." "I know what it is," she said, "and I know what we need to do about it. But we have to do it right, because if we go at Victor Crowley without enough evidence, he has the resources to bury us in legal challenges until we can't afford to fight anymore." She held his gaze. "I need time to trace the brokerage, find out who filed the contract, when, with what authority. There are records somewhere. There always are." Gideon sat with this. Clock on the mantel counted out a full minute. "How long?" he said. "I don't know yet, as fast as I can." He looked at the document on his desk. Then he looked at her. "All right," he said. The 3rd time since she'd arrived, in 3 very different situations, said the same 2 words, in the same way a man deciding to trust someone's judgment over his own impulse. which was not a small thing for a man like Gideon Blackwood. She gathered the document carefully and went back to the records room and sat down and began making a list of every land brokerage office in the Wyoming Territory that would have been legally required to file a copy of an option agreement on real property. It was a long list. She was going to work through every name on it. She had no idea, sitting there in the lamplight with the Wyoming wind pressing against the window and the contract copy in front of her, what that work was going to cost before it was done. She would have done it anyway. That was simply the kind of person she was. The list of land brokerage offices had 27 names on it, and Eliza worked through them the way she worked through most difficult things methodically, without rushing, and without telling anyone how much of her sleep she was trading for the effort. She wrote letters. Careful, specific letters that asked precise questions about filing records and option agreements registered in the Wyoming Territory within a 14-month window. She phrased them in the dry administrative language she'd learned from the territorial auditor's visit, the language that sounded like routine record verification, and not like a woman trying to prove that one of the most powerful men in the county had forged her employer's signature on a fraudulent contract. She sent 12 letters in the first week. The responses that came back were either unhelpful or absent, which told her something. A pattern of unhelpfulness can be as informative as a direct answer if you know what you're looking for. She narrowed the list. Consolidated Western Holdings had to have a registered agent somewhere in the territory. The option on real property of that scale couldn't exist without a paper trail, because paper trails were how the law protected the people filing the contracts, which meant Crowley's people had been careful, but not invisible. Nobody was invisible if you knew where to look. She wrote to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Cheyenne directly, a formal inquiry that took her 3 drafts to get exactly right, and she sent it on a Tuesday morning without telling Gideon she'd done it. She wasn't hiding it from him. She simply didn't want to give him something else to wait on. He had enough to wait on already. December arrived in Wyoming, the way December arrived in that country without ceremony and without mercy. Temperature dropped fast and stayed down, and the work of the ranch adjusted itself around the cold with the pragmatic efficiency of an operation that had survived multiple winters and knew the cost of being unprepared. The hands worked longer days and shorter light. The horses needed more feed and more attention. The water troughs froze overnight and had to be broken every morning before the cattle could drink. Eliza learned all of this in real time. Alongside the work she was already doing, she made herself useful in every way she could identify, because useful was what she knew how to be. Because making herself necessary to the practical functioning of the ranch left her less time to think about the things she couldn't yet control. She was in the barn at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday, helping break the ice on the near trough with a long-handled mallet, when Holt appeared beside her and took the mallet out of her hands without comment and finished the job in 3 strikes. She accepted this without protest. Her arms were tired. "You're up earlier than the hands," he said. "The cold woke me." He looked at her sideways. Holt had developed a habit of sideways looks that she'd come to understand as his version of a more direct conversation. "You're not sleeping much. I'm sleeping enough." Gideon's the same when something's worrying him. Moves around the house at all hours. He paused. "Find something in those records." It wasn't quite a question. "I found something," she said. "I'm still working out what it means." "Crowley," he said flatly. She looked at him. He shrugged, a minimal movement, the shrug of a man who has been paying attention for a long time. "He's been after this land for years," Holt said. "Every time Gideon says no, Crowley goes quiet for a while, and then something else happens. Supplier trouble, equipment failure. 2 years back, we had a problem with our grazing permit that nearly cost us the north pasture access. Turned out to be a clerical error at the county office." He let a pause sit there. Convenient clerical error. Eliza thought about the contract. Signature that wasn't Gideon's, but looked like it. About how a man with enough money and enough patience could manufacture clerical errors indefinitely, each one small enough to look like coincidence, together large enough to grind a ranch into a position where selling felt like the only option left. "How long has he been doing it?" she asked. "Long as I've been here. 7 years. And Gideon knows this is deliberate. Bex. He doesn't have proof." Holt handed the mallet back to her. "Neither does anyone else." She looked at the mallet in her hand. "I'm trying to get it." He nodded once, the complete nod of a man who has said everything he intended to say and went back to his morning work. The letter from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after she'd sent her inquiry. was short, bureaucratic, and enormously useful. Commissioner's office confirmed that an option agreement on real property described as Blackwood Creek Ranch, sections 14 and 15, had been registered by a filing agent named Joseph Carver on behalf of Consolidated Western Holdings, dated 11 months prior. The filing agent's registered address was a law office in Laramie. The option had been submitted with supporting documentation, including a signed authorization from the property owner. The authorization that was not Gideon's. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then went immediately to Gideon's study. He was reviewing the winter feed orders, which he set down without comment when he saw her expression. She put the letter on the desk. He read it. "Joseph Carver," he said. "Don't know who he is yet." "Laramie." "Yes." He leaned back in his chair. His face had gone to the controlled stillness she'd learned, meant he was working very hard to stay inside the boundaries of rational action. The authorization they submitted. Someone would have had to prepare a document that looked like my signature was genuine. Someone who'd seen my signature enough to replicate it. "Yes," Eliza said, or had access to signed documents they could copy from. They looked at each other. "Who has access to your signed documents?" she asked. "Holt occasionally. My bank in Cutter's Run handles anything requiring a notary." He paused. "And the account at Harmon and Dale would have had my signature on the original supply agreement." "Reg Fowler," Eliza said. The name landed in the room like something solid. Reg Fowler, who had been quietly stealing from the Harmon and Dale supply invoices for 19 months. Reg Fowler, who had left Cutter's Run under circumstances that were not discussed in polite company, which meant nobody knew exactly where he'd gone. "It was never just Fowler," Gideon said slowly. "Fowler was. Fowler was a piece of it," Eliza said. "Crowley needed someone inside the supply chain. Someone who saw your signature regularly. Fowler could have copied it from the original supply agreement and passed it to Carver. We have no proof of that." "Not yet." She took the letter back. "I need to find Joseph Carver. I need to know who engaged him, what he was paid, and what documentation he was given." Gideon looked at her steadily. "That's in Laramie." "I know, Eliza. Laramie is 3 days in this weather." She knew that, too. She'd been calculating it since the letter arrived, and she'd been thinking about Lily's face and Caleb's bird book and the way the word home had started to feel less conditional. She'd been arguing with herself about it in the space between when she'd received the letter and when she'd brought it to Gideon, which had been approximately 20 minutes. "I can be ready by Friday morning," she said. He stood up from the desk. "I'll go. You have to stay with the ranch. If you leave for Laramie now and Crowley finds out you're looking at those records, someone else goes." Holt doesn't know what he's looking for," she said carefully and without apology. "Legal language in those documents is specific. I've been reading contract law for 3 weeks. I know what questions to ask Carver and how to read what his answers mean." She held his gaze. "I'm not doing this because I'm reckless. I'm doing it because I'm the right person to go." The long silence. Gideon turned to the window and looked at the Wyoming December outside, the frost on the grass, the gray sky pressing down, the distance between here and anywhere else made longer and harder by cold that had no interest in human plans. "Takes care of Lily while you're gone," he said. And the question arrived in a different register than she expected, something lower than pure practicality. "I was going to ask if she could stay here," Eliza said. It was the question she'd been most uncertain about. "Caleb? With you?" He turned back from the window. "Nah." He looked at her with the same expression she'd seen the evening of the Harmon resolution, the one that was less professional distance and more something she hadn't fully cataloged yet. "Of course she can," he said. She told Lily that evening after supper, in the room with 2 beds that had started to feel genuinely like theirs. Lily sat on her bed and listened to the explanation with the concentrated seriousness she brought to all significant information, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on Eliza's face. "How many days? 6 probably. Maybe 7. Lily thought about this. "Will Mr. Blackwood make sure I have breakfast?"
"Yes."
"And Holt's wife comes in on Tuesdays to help with the cooking, so you'll have proper meals. Can I help Caleb with the birds in the morning?" "If he wants that, yes." Another pause. Lily looked at her hands. "Is it dangerous?" Eliza chose her words. "It's cold and it's far. I'll be careful." "That's not the same as not dangerous." "No," Eliza said. "It's not." She moved to sit beside Lily on the bed. "You trust me to be careful?" Lily leaned against her shoulder, which was her answer. "I'll come back," Eliza said. 6 days 7 if it takes 7, Lily said. Very quietly. Eliza pressed her lips against the top of Lily's head and held there for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary, and made herself a private promise she intended to keep. She left on Friday at first light with a hired driver named Walt, who Gideon had arranged through a man he trusted in Cutter's Run. A weathered wagon, 2 days' provisions, and the accumulated paperwork of 3 weeks of research organized into a leather satchel she kept on the seat beside her. Gideon had walked her to the wagon in the dark of the early morning, Holt a few paces behind. He'd checked the provisions without comment and looked at the satchel and looked at her. Carver Law Office is on Galena Street, he said. Second floor of the Merritt Building. I've had dealings with that street before. How? The bank in Laramie holds a secondary account. I know the notary on the ground floor. A pause. His name is Whitfield. Tell him I sent you. He'll at least point you in the right direction. She hadn't known he had a contact there. She stored it and nodded. Carver won't talk to you. Gideon started. He'll talk to me, she said. People talk to women they've underestimated. They think they're managing the conversation. He looked at her for a moment. The cold morning air between them was very still. Be careful, he said. It came out slightly rough, slightly more than a professional courtesy, and she thought he probably knew that and had said it anyway. I will, she said. The wagon pulled away. She looked back once at the ranch house lights in the dark, at Gideon's standing figure, at the wide Wyoming sky beginning its slow change from black to the deep blue of pre-dawn, and then she turned forward and didn't look back again. The road to Laramie was 3 days of cold that she had not been fully prepared for, despite knowing intellectually that it was coming. Walt was a competent driver and an economical conversationalist, which suited her. Spoke when something needed saying, and not otherwise. He knew the road well enough to avoid the worst of the drifted sections, and to find the stage stops that had feed for the horse and enough warmth inside for a person to stop shivering for an hour before getting back on the road. She spent the nights at those stops, in rooms that were basic in the way that frontier accommodation was basic, which was to say, honest about what they were, and nothing else. She used the travel time to organize her thoughts, which was the kind of work that looked like sitting still and was actually more demanding than most physical labor. She went over what she knew and what she needed to know, and the gap between them, which was still significant. She had the commissioner's letter. She had the fraudulent contract copy. She had the connection between Rage Fowler and Crowley that was logical but not proven. She needed Carver. She thought about how to approach him. Direct accusation would close him down. A legal bluff she wasn't prepared to sustain would collapse. What she had was documentation, and the right questions, and the willingness to let silence do the work that words couldn't. She had been using silence effectively since she was 12 years old. She was going to need it now. Laramie was larger than Cutter's Run and smaller than the version of it she'd built in her mind, which was usually how places went when you'd been anticipating them. Sat against the land, with the particular solidity of a town that knew what it was a working place. Not a pretty one, and in the December cold, it had the stripped-down look of anywhere that has put away its seasonal courtesies and is simply enduring. Walt delivered her to a boarding house on the main street and told her he'd be back in 2 days, which was the arrangement. She had 2 days in Laramie. She intended to use every hour of them. Notary Whitfield, on the ground floor of the Merritt Building, turned out to be a small, precise man in his 60s who reacted to Gideon's name with a nod of genuine recognition, and to Eliza herself with the kind of careful courtesy that suggested he had learned long ago to adjust his assumptions about strangers before they proved him wrong. Carver, he said when she explained what she needed. His expression did something. She couldn't entirely read a flicker of something between recognition and caution. Has an office on the second floor. I know. Is he here today? He was as of this morning. Whitfield looked at her steadily. Joseph Carver has a reputation for handling sensitive filings for clients who prefer not to be directly associated with documents. That's a careful way to describe it, she said. I'm a notary. Careful is professional, is he honest? A longer pause. He's technically within the law, usually. He does what he's paid to do, and he keeps records because that protects him. If someone wanted to challenge a filing he handled, the records would show he followed the procedures he was given. Whether the documentation he was given was genuine, Whitfield spread his hands. It's not his department. He would have verified the identity of the person authorizing the option agreement, Eliza said. He should have. He should have, Whitfield agreed. The way he said it communicated his opinion of whether this had occurred. He didn't verify it properly, and the authorization is fraudulent. He has exposure, she said. Yes, Whitfield said, he does. Then he has a reason to talk to me. Whitfield looked at her with the expression of a man revising an estimate upward. Second floor, he said. End of the hall. Joseph Carver was a large man who had gone to softness, perhaps 50, with the kind of face that was accustomed to looking comfortable and was not managing it very well at this particular moment. Gatta. He looked at Eliza when she came through his office door. She had knocked and been told to come in without giving her name, which she'd done deliberately, and he looked at the leather satchel she set on the chair across from his desk. And he looked back at her face, and something behind his eyes shifted in the way things shift when a person is making a rapid calculation about whether they are in more trouble than they realized. I don't have an appointment with anyone, he said. No, she said, I didn't make one. What can I do for you, Mrs. Whitmore? She sat down in the chair beside the satchel without being invited to. I represent the interests of Gideon Blackwood of Blackwood Creek Ranch. I'm here about an option agreement you filed 11 months ago on behalf of Consolidated Western Holdings. She watched the calculation accelerate behind his eyes. I file many agreements, he said. I'm sure you do. She opened the satchel and produced the commissioner's letter and set it on his desk. This one involved property in sections 14 and 15 of the Blackwood Creek holding. You submitted a signed authorization from the property owner. I have a copy of that authorization. She produced the copy of the fraudulent contract and set it beside the letter. Carver did not pick either document up. He looked at them from a careful distance, the way a man looks at something he's deciding whether to acknowledge. Signature on that authorization is not Gideon Blackwood's signature, Eliza said. I have his genuine signature on 17 documents spanning the last 4 years for comparison. Forgery is competent, but it has specific characteristics that differ from the authentic signature in 3 measurable ways. True, she had worked it out over 2 evenings with a magnifying glass and a pencil, and the patience of someone who had nothing more important to do after 11 o'clock at night. If you verified this authorization against the actual property owner, she continued, you would have caught those differences. Which means either you failed to verify it, which is professional negligence, or you verified it and filed it anyway, which is something more serious. The room was very quiet. Carver's large hands were flat on his desk, very still in the posture of a man trying not to show that he was rattled. I have clients, he said finally. Attorney-client privilege. You're a filing agent, not an attorney, Eliza said. Privilege doesn't apply. A longer silence. Who engaged you? She said. I have a reasonable idea already. I'm here because I need the documentation of that engagement. Name of the person or company who hired you, the payment records, the instructions you were given regarding the authorization. Carver looked at her. She looked back at him without particular expression. Guy. She had learned over the last several weeks that the most powerful thing she could do in a difficult conversation was to simply occupy the silence comfortably while the other person became increasingly uncomfortable inside it. If I gave you that information, he said slowly, the person who engaged me would know about it. Not necessarily. And if you don't give it to me, the Territorial Commissioner's Office will be asking you the same questions in a formal proceeding. Difference is that I'm not looking to damage you specifically. I'm looking for the person who gave you a fraudulent document and asked you to file it as genuine. Carver looked at the documents on his desk. He looked at the window, looked at his hands. He opened his desk drawer and produced a file. He didn't hand it to her. He set it on the edge of the desk and turned it so the writing faced her. I need to step out, he said. Briefly. He stood and went to the door and opened it and looked at her once more and left it open, which she understood as his version of a line he was willing to step up to but not fully cross. She leaned forward and read. The file contained 3 documents. The engagement letter, which named the hiring party as Consolidated Western Holdings with a contact address that was a post office box in Denver. Payment record, which showed a significant amount paid in 2 installments from a private bank draft. And the instructions given to Carver regarding the filing, which specified that the authorization had been signed by the property owner and did not require additional verification because the signing had been witnessed by a notary whose name and stamp appeared on the authorization itself. Notary stamp was genuine. She recognized the name. It was the notary from the bank in Cutter's Run. She sat with this for a moment. Then she opened her satchel and produced paper and a pencil and wrote down every relevant detail in the file, the post office box, the payment amounts, the dates, notary's name, working quickly and carefully. Carver would return in some number of minutes, and she did not intend to be here when that happened. She was at the door by the time she heard him on the stairs. She went past him in the hallway with a brief nod. "Thank you for your time," she said. He said nothing. Meh. He watched her go with the expression of a man who has done something that might have been right or might have been very costly and who will not know for some time which one it was. She was in the street, moving toward the main road, when the first real problem of the trip arrived. She heard her name, in a voice she recognized, and she turned before she thought better of it. The man standing 20 feet behind her was a broad, well-dressed figure in a heavy coat, and he had not been in Laramie last time she'd checked, but the world was a smaller place than it seemed sometimes. Victor Crowley looked at her across the December street with an expression she couldn't read at this distance, though she had enough of a feel for him by now to make a reasonable guess. He had not expected to see her here. He was deciding in real time what that meant. She made her face neutral and kept walking. "Miss Whitmore," he called after her. She didn't stop. She heard him moving, not running. Crowley was too controlled for running, and she turned the next corner and went quickly down the side street and through the passage between two buildings that she'd noted on her way in, because she had always had the habit of noting exits. She came out on a parallel street, moved half a block, and went into the general merchandise store there without looking behind her. Look-ah. She stood in the warmth of the store for 2 minutes, watching the street through the front window. Crowley appeared at the far end, looked both directions, and stood for a moment in the way a man stands when he has lost the thread of something. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. The store proprietor was looking at her. "Cold out," she said. "Sure is," he said. She bought a pair of wool gloves she didn't need and left through the back. She was back at the boarding house by early afternoon, and she spent the rest of the day writing. She wrote it all down, in precise order, the commissioner's letter, Carver's file, notary name from the Cutter's Run Bank, connection between Reed Fowler's position at Harmon and Dale, and his access to Gideon's signature, and her assessment of how these pieces connected to Victor Crowley. She wrote it the way she would have written an account ledger entry, no emotion, no assumption, only what she could document and what she had seen with her own eyes. At the end, she wrote a separate note about seeing Crowley on the street, and what she believed his presence in Laramie might mean for the timeline. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the boarding house room and listened to Laramie at night, which was different from Wyoming at night, and she thought about everything she now knew and everything she still needed. Notary at the Cutter's Run Bank, that was the piece that changed it. As a notary who had stamped a fraudulent authorization had committed a crime, and a man who had committed a crime had an incentive to keep that crime quiet, which meant Crowley had leverage over at least one person inside Cutter's. Run the town where Gideon did his banking, where Eliza did her buying, where Caleb had gone to school before his mother died. This wasn't a business dispute anymore. This was a network, patient, embedded, invisible, unless you knew exactly what you were looking at. And Victor Crowley had just seen her walking out of the Merritt building. Walt picked her up at the arranged time, and they started back. Return road was colder than the approach had been, a front coming in from the north that dropped the temperature by 10 degrees on the first day and kept dropping. They pushed harder than Walt would normally have chosen, which he did without complaint, because he was a man who could read urgency in a passenger's face. On the second night of the return journey, at a stage stop that was barely more than a walls-and-roof situation with a fireplace, she wrote another letter. This one was to the Territorial Marshal's office. She phrased it carefully, presented the documentary evidence she had, and asked for a formal investigation into the filing of a fraudulent land option agreement. She named Joseph Carver as the filing agent and Consolidated Western Holdings as the engaging party. She did not name Victor Crowley directly, because she didn't yet have his name in any of the documents, and naming him without documentation would look like accusation without evidence. She had the notary's name. That was enough to start. Ziffin. She sent the letter with the stage rider the following morning at first light, paid the extra fee for priority delivery, and watched it go with the specific feeling of a person who is committed to something they cannot take back. That feeling was not entirely uncomfortable. She arrived back at Blackwood Creek Ranch on the evening of the 6th day, as she'd promised. The lamp was burning in the kitchen window when the wagon came up the road. She saw it from a distance and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. Lily came through the kitchen door before the wagon had fully stopped, running across the frost-stiff ground in her coat with both arms open, and Eliza stepped down from the wagon and caught her, and held on longer than was probably dignified and didn't particularly care. 6 days exactly, Lily said into her shoulder. 6 days, Eliza confirmed. Over Lily's head, she saw Gideon standing in the kitchen doorway. Gritty. He was watching them with an expression she couldn't fully catalog in the low light, but she saw clearly enough that it wasn't the expression of a man conducting a professional arrangement. She brought Lily inside. She sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on, and Lily pressed against her side. She told Gideon everything: Carver, the file, the notary, Crowley on the street, the letter to the marshal's office. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Holt, who had materialized in the doorway at some point during the account, listened too. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. The notary, Gideon said. Miles Greer, you know him. I've signed documents in front of him 6 times. Works for the bank. His voice was very level, the kind of level that costs something to maintain. Notarized our quarterly account statements. He had access to your signature and your official documents, Eliza said. He would have been the mechanism for making the authorization look genuine. He has a family, Gideon said. 3 daughters. I know that doesn't change what he did, Eliza said carefully. It might change why. Holt spoke from the doorway, low and certain. Crowley pressured him. Gore paid him enough that he felt he had no choice. Nobody argued with this. The marshal's office has the letter, Eliza said. Once they begin the investigation, Carver and Greer both have reasons to cooperate. Both have exposure. The investigation follows the money the payment drafts from the Denver post office box, and that trail leads to whoever actually controls Consolidated Western Holdings. Crowley keeps himself 1 step removed, Gideon said. Well, he always has. That's why nothing's ever stuck. But the step between him and the filing has names on it now, Eliza said. Carver's name, Greer's name, and Carver knows I've read the file. Gideon looked at her. Crowley saw you leaving Carver's building. Yes. He knows you found something. Yes. The weight of this sat in the kitchen between them. Lily had fallen asleep against Eliza's side, her head on Eliza's arm, breathing the deep, even breath of a child who had waited 6 days and had gotten the thing she was waiting for and could now fully rest. Holt said, he'll move faster now. Yes, Eliza said. Will. Gideon was quiet for a long time. He looked at Lily sleeping. He looked at the table. He looked at Eliza. You're not surprised, he said. I planned for it, she said. The letter to the marshal's office establishes a timeline. Everything I documented is already in official hands. Crowley tries to discredit the investigation now. It looks like what it is: a guilty man trying to suppress evidence. Won't try to discredit it, Gideon said slowly. He'll try to discredit you. She had expected this too. She nodded. He'll put the story out that you're a desperate woman who arrived here with nothing and manufactured a crisis to make herself indispensable, Gideon said. He'll say the documents are fabricated. He'll say you've been filling my head with nonsense to protect your own position here. Yes, she said. He'll say all of that, and some people will believe it. Some people will, yes. Gideon looked at her steadily. Does that frighten you? She thought about the question honestly. People have been saying versions of that about me my whole life, she said. I found that the best response to it is to be so thoroughly documented that anyone who looks at the evidence can see the difference between the story and the truth. He looked at her for a long time in the lamplight of the kitchen, with Lily sleeping against her arm and the Wyoming cold pressed against every window. And whatever the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who was simply assessing the practical competence of a woman he'd hired to manage his household accounts. Need to rest, he said finally. I know. I'll take Lily up. She started to say she'd do it herself, and then she stopped, because she was very tired, and because Gideon was already carefully lifting Lily from her side, with the particular practiced gentleness of a man who had carried a sleeping child before and knew how to do it without waking them. Lily's head settled against his shoulder without so much as a murmur, carried her up the stairs. Eliza sat at the kitchen table a moment longer, listening to his footsteps above her, thought about Victor Crowley seeing her on that street in Laramie with his quickly calculating eyes. Gunn thought about what he would do next, and thought about whether she'd given herself enough time and enough documentation to be ready for it. She thought, probably. She thought, possibly she thought, the difference between those two things might matter a great deal before this was over. She got up, turned down the kitchen lamp, went to bed, slept more solidly than she had in 3 weeks. Because she had done what she went to do, and the rest of it would come when it came. She was ready enough. She had to be. Crowley moved faster than she'd expected, which told her he was more frightened than he'd looked on that Laramie street. Story reached Cutter's Run within 4 days of her return. She heard about it from Holt, who heard it from the feed merchant, who had it from 3 different sources in the same morning, which was how you could tell a rumor had been deliberately seeded rather than naturally grown. Organic gossip spread unevenly, catching in some places and missing others, moving with the randomness of water finding its own path. This story arrived everywhere at once, which meant someone had planned its distribution. Version circulating in Cutter's Run was this: Eliza Whitmore had arrived at Blackwood Creek Ranch under false pretenses, presenting herself as a capable housekeeper, when she was in fact a woman of questionable background who had manufactured a child to appear sympathetic. She had systematically inserted herself into the ranch's financial records under the pretense of helping, and was now fabricating evidence of wrongdoing against respected local businessmen in order to make herself indispensable to a grieving widower who was too distracted by loss to see what was happening in his own house. It was, she had to admit, a well-constructed story. It had the quality of good slander enough truth mixed in to give the lie somewhere to stand. She had arrived as a mail-order bride. She did have a child. She had inserted herself into the financial records. All of those things were accurate. The interpretation placed on them was designed to make every real fact look like evidence of deception. She heard the story from Holt on a Monday morning, standing in the kitchen with her coffee. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough," Holt said. "Barbara Hennessy's told half the women in town. The feed merchants repeated it to every rancher who's come in this week." He paused. "Miles Greer is telling people you threatened him in Laramie." She set down her cup. "Greer is talking, apparently. He's scared," she said. "If the marshal's investigation reaches him, he needs a story that makes him the victim." Is that good or bad? She thought about it. It depends on whether he's scared enough to cooperate with the investigation or scared enough to do whatever Crowley tells him to do. Holt's expression said he was not optimistic about which way that would land. She told Gideon that evening. He sat across the table and listened with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table, which was his posture when he was deciding against several responses he'd already rejected. "I want to go talk to Crowley directly," he said. "That's the worst thing you can do right now. I'm telling people my wife is a fraud." The word hung between them for a second. He hadn't used it before, not that word, not directly, in that specific context. The arrangement had always been discussed in the careful language of practical partnership. Whitmore woman. The arrangement. Miss Whitmore's work on the accounts. Gideon had used the word with the reflexive ownership of someone who hadn't thought about it first, and she could see from the slight change in his expression that he'd noticed this too. He didn't take it back. "If you go to Crowley now," Eliza said, after a moment, "he'll use it. Yeah, he'll tell people you're protecting a woman you've become personally invested in, which proves you've lost your judgment. He needs you to react. He's been engineering situations for 7 years specifically to provoke a response he can use." Gideon looked at her. "So we wait. We let the marshal's investigation do its work. Everything I sent is documented. Carver has exposure. Greer has exposure. The moment either of them cooperates with the investigation, Crowley's 1 removed becomes 0 removed. And in the meantime, everyone in Cutter's Run thinks you're a con artist. Some of them already thought I was beneath you," she said, with more evenness than she felt. "This isn't entirely new." He looked at her for a long time. "Bothers me," he said. "I want you to know that. What he's saying about you, it bothers me considerably." She believed him. She could see that it did. It was written in the precise, controlled tension of his face, a man who was doing something very difficult, which was sitting still when every instinct said move. "I know," she said. "I also know that you doing something about it right now would cost us more than the story costs us." "So we hold," he exhaled. "All right," he said. For the 4th time, 2 words in the way that said more than the words themselves. The holding was harder than the doing had been. Eliza kept her routine intact, because routine was both productive and a form of argument. She went to Cutter's Run on her regular supply days. She did not avoid Barbara Hennessy's counter. She did not change her manner or her pace or the directness with which she met people's eyes, because any change would look like confirmation, and she had done nothing that required her to flinch. Some people looked away when she passed. Some nodded, with a careful neutrality that was better than hostility. Few of the older ranchers' wives, women, who had survived their own versions of what the frontier could do to a person, watched her with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but was adjacent to respect. Filed each of these away without assigning too much weight to any of them. What she hadn't anticipated was Caleb. He came to find her on a Wednesday afternoon, appearing in the doorway of the records room, with the particular combination of purposefulness and awkwardness that she'd come to recognize as his version of working up to something. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. "Yes," she said and put down her pencil. Came in and stood on the other side of the work table, not sitting. He'd grown an inch in the 3 months since she'd arrived, which she'd noticed because she noticed things. And in the winter light, he looked both younger than his age and very much older, the way children do when they've been asked to carry something too heavy too soon. "People in town are saying things about you," he said. "I know. They're wrong." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, they are. My father knows they're wrong." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, working on something. "Some of the boys at the school in town, their parents told them things. They said them to me when I went in last Thursday." He paused. "I told them they were liars." Eliza held her expression. "What happened after that?" "Holt had to come. Get me," Caleb said, with the exact same flat factual delivery that Gideon used when he was reporting something he considered self-explanatory. She pressed her lips together. She could not, under any circumstances, appear to find this funny. "Caleb, you cannot get into physical altercations at school over. I didn't start it. I understand that. But getting into fights doesn't help." "Felt like it helped," he said. Then very quickly, before she could respond to that, "I know it didn't actually help." "I know," he looked at the table. People keep saying things about you and Lily, and I know they're wrong, and it makes me—" He stopped. "You angry?" she offered. "Yeah." He looked up at her. "Is that bad?" "No," she said honestly. "Anger is a reasonable response to injustice. Question is what you do with it." He thought about this with his characteristic thoroughness. "What do you do with it?" She considered the question the way it deserved. "I put it somewhere useful," she said finally. "I take the energy of it and I put it into the work, into the evidence, into making sure that when the moment comes to say what's true, I have more than words, I have documentation." He looked at her in a way that reminded her, sharply and unexpectedly, of the way he'd looked at her the morning with the mayor. The wariness still there, but something else operating underneath it now, something that was beginning to look like genuine trust, and which she treated with the same care she gave all fragile things. "You think it'll work?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I think it'll work. It's going to take longer than I want it to, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, and people are going to say more things that aren't true. But yes, I think it'll work." He nodded. He seemed to find this sufficient. He was almost at the door when she said, "Caleb, thank you for what you did." He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders change slightly. "Holt says I've got your stubbornness," he said. "Holt's been paying attention," she said. Went. She sat a moment with the sudden fullness of what had just happened, and then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. Marshall's investigator arrived in Cutter's Run on a Tuesday in late January, which was 11 weeks after she'd sent the letter. His name was Beaumont, a lean, quiet man in his 40s who asked questions the way she imagined good surgeons worked, precise, in the right order, without wasting motion. Came to the ranch first, which was protocol. She laid out the full documentation for him at the kitchen table over 2 hours, while Gideon sat to one side and Holt stood in the doorway. Then she walked Beaumont through every piece in sequence. Fraudulent contract, commissioner's letter, the Carver file information, notary identification, the Harmon and Dale discrepancy records, and her written account of Reg Fowler's position and probable role. Beaumont asked specific, well-formed questions. She answered them precisely and without embellishment. When he asked how she'd obtained the information from Carver's office, she told him exactly what had happened, including that Carver had stepped out of the room, because the truth was always more durable than a careful version of it. "You're aware that Carver may claim he never showed you the file," Beaumont said.
"Yes."
"But the information in the file is consistent with what the commissioner's office independently confirmed. He can deny showing me his records. He can't change what's in the territorial filing." Beaumont looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his notes. "Mr. Blackwood, this authorization that was filed, you have never seen this document before Miss Whitmore found it in your records." "Never," Gideon said. "And you have no memory of signing any option agreement with Consolidated Western Holdings or any affiliated entity." "None whatsoever. And you can produce your own signature from the relevant time period for comparison?" "She's already done that," Gideon said, with a slight movement of his head toward Eliza. Beaumont looked at the comparative signature analysis she'd produced. He looked at it for a long time. "This is thorough work," he said. "Thank you," she said. "What's your professional background, Miss Whitmore?" I managed my family's household accounts in Missouri for 8 years. No formal training. He looked at her again with the expression of someone filing a significant revision. Then he closed his notebook and stood. I'll be in Cutter's Run for the next several days. I'll need to speak with Miles Greer at the bank. Suggest doing that before he has a chance to consult with anyone else, Eliza said. Beaumont looked at her. That's also my instinct, he said. Left. Miles Greer broke on the second day. She didn't witness this directly. She heard it from Holt, who heard it from his wife's cousin, who worked at the general store 2 doors from the bank and had seen Beaumont go in on Tuesday morning, and Miles Greer leave with him mid-afternoon, in a manner that was not the manner of a man going willingly for a pleasant conversation. Greer had a family, 3 daughters and a wife who kept the accounts for his household, with the same modest care that people of limited means applied to things that couldn't afford to go wrong. He also had, it turned out, debt, a private and significant one, accrued through a business investment 2 years prior that had gone badly and quietly. Kind of thing a man kept off the public ledger, because the shame of it was worse than the financial reality. Crowley had found it. Of course he had. A man who operated the way Victor Crowley operated was always finding the precise pressure point in anyone who might be useful, storing it carefully, applying it at the moment of maximum leverage. What Greer told Beaumont in the specifics, which Eliza didn't get until later, was this. Crowley had approached him privately, acknowledged awareness of the debt, offered a simple exchange. Greer would notarize a document that Crowley's people would bring to him. The document would appear to be a standard property authorization. Greer would stamp it, date it correctly, and say nothing about it to anyone. In exchange, the debt would be quietly absorbed. Greer had known the authorization was fraudulent. He had stamped it anyway, because he was a frightened man with 3 daughters and a wife who didn't know about the debt. And the space between what he should have done and what he did was the same space that good people sometimes fall into when they're sufficiently afraid. Told Beaumont all of it, including the name of the man who had brought the document to him, not Crowley directly, never Crowley directly, but a man who worked for Crowley's land office named Aldous Crane, who handled the arrangements that Crowley preferred not to be associated with personally. Crane was in Cutter's Run. Beaumont had him in a room by Thursday. Gideon heard the news from Beaumont directly on a Friday evening, and he came into the kitchen afterward and stood at the window for a while before he said anything. Eliza was at the table with the supply orders for February, which needed attention regardless of what else was happening, and she waited. Greer cooperated fully, Gideon said finally. I know. Holt told me this afternoon. Crane's been in custody since Thursday.
Yes.
Beaumont says they have enough to bring charges against Crowley. Post office box in Denver traces to a trust in Crowley's name through 2 intermediate holding companies. Aldous Crane is cooperating in exchange for reduced charges. Gideon turned from the window. His face was doing the complicated thing it did when he was feeling several things at once and didn't know which to lead with. It's over. The legal part, Eliza said carefully. Yes. There'll still be proceedings. It'll take time to work through. The ranch is safe. Yes. The option agreement will be ruled void once the forgery is formally established. Water rights stay with the property. Gideon nodded slowly, came to the table and sat down not across from her, but at the corner, closer than he usually placed himself in practical conversations. He looked at the supply orders she'd been working on. Looked at her hands. He looked at her face. I want to say something, he said. All right. I'm not good at this kind of thing, he said. Saying things. Clara could tell you my first wife. She used to say I expressed myself primarily in fence repairs and early mornings. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, warm and private. She wasn't wrong. Eliza waited. What you did, he said. The Laramie trip. The documentation, every piece of it. I know what it cost you to do it, the cold, the time away from Lily, the risk of Crowley seeing you and knowing you'd found something. He paused. And then what he did after. The things he put out about you in town. I know you said it was manageable. I know you said the documentation would outlast the rumor. He looked at her steadily. Doesn't mean I don't know what it cost you to sit with it. She held his gaze. She didn't say it was nothing, because it hadn't been nothing, and she'd already decided she wasn't going to lie to this man about small things any more than she lied to his son about them. I sat with it because the alternative was worse, she said. You sat with it because you're the kind of person who does what needs doing, even when it's hard, he said. And you don't make a performance of it. You just do it, and then you go back to work. He was quiet for a moment. I've known very few people like that in my life. Kitchen was very still. Outside, the January wind was doing what it did, pressing against the house with the patient intensity of something that didn't need to hurry because it had all the time in the world. Inside, the lamp on the table burned between them and the supply orders sat untouched, and she was acutely aware of how close he was sitting. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said quickly. "This isn't the moment for this conversation. Still the proceedings in the town, and I know the arrangement we made was—" He stopped. "I just needed you to know what it means, what you've done for this family." I needed to say it. She looked at him for a long moment. "I hear you," she said. And then carefully, because she was being honest, "I'm not going anywhere." Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, Gideon Blackwood did not do dramatic. It shifted in a way that was distinct and real, and that she was going to carry somewhere private and think about later. "Good," he said. Simple, certain. He picked up the February supply orders. "Overpaying for oats again," he said. "The Kellerman supplier is cheaper by 8 cents a pound if you buy in volume." "I know the Kellerman supplier." "Then you should have told me 3 weeks ago." He almost smiled. Almost. The story in Cutter's Run changed direction the following week, in the way that stories do when the facts become too large to argue with. It didn't change all at once, it never does. But it changed. Aldous Crane's custody was public knowledge by Wednesday. Victor Crowley's name was in a formal legal notice by the following Friday, which was posted on the board outside the county clerk's office in the manner required by territorial law for pending fraud investigations. Notice was dry and bureaucratic and said nothing dramatic, but the people of Cutter's Run were capable of reading what it implied, and most of them did. Barbara Hennessy was the first person in town to say something to Eliza that was not hostile. Was at the dry goods counter, which was the field of every previous exchange they'd had, and Barbara set the correctly measured salt on the counter with a slightly different energy than usual, not warm, not apologetic, but without the calculated coldness of before. "I heard the marshal's office has Crane in custody," Barbara said. "That's my understanding," Eliza said. "And that Crowley's name is on a fraud notice." "Yes." A pause. Barbara looked at the counter between them. Things people were saying. "About you." She stopped. Started again. "Some of us probably should have waited longer before deciding what we thought." It was the least graceful apology Eliza had ever received. It was also probably the most honest one, and she valued honesty over grace. "It's a small town," Eliza said. "People talk. I'd have had a harder time trusting it if nobody had said anything at all." Barbara looked at her with an expression she clearly hadn't expected to be making at this counter on this Thursday. It was somewhere between relief and startlement. 200 pounds of flour, she said. "In the correct grade this time, please," Eliza said pleasantly. Something happened in Barbara Hennessy's face that was very close to a smile. Lily had been watching all of it from her own position, which was the position of a child who paid extremely careful attention and said less about what she observed than she understood. She came to Eliza on a Sunday afternoon, finding her in the records room, which was less a records room now, and more simply her room, the space the household understood as hers. Place where the lamp burned late and the pencil moved, and the complicated work of keeping Blackwood Creek's affairs in order happened day after day. "Caleb wants to show you something," Lily said. Eliza looked up. "What?" "He won't tell me. He says it has to be you." This was unusual enough that she put down her pencil immediately. Caleb was waiting in the sitting room, which he almost never used, standing by the window with his bird book in his hands, and an expression of concentrated uncertainty, the look of someone who has decided to do something that feels risky and hasn't yet committed fully to having decided it. He held out the book. "I added pages in the back," he said. "For the ones I've seen since—" He stopped. "Since you came." She took the book. She opened to the back pages where his careful handwriting continued past the original entries, dated from late October through January. Were more of the small, marginal sketches: a winter wren, a rough-legged hawk, a flock of birds she didn't recognize, and beside each one, date and a brief observation. Writing was the same as the earlier entries, careful and detailed, but these observations had a different quality. Small things noted that weren't strictly about the birds. November 14th, cold morning, Lily counted 15 sparrows on the fence before breakfast. December 2nd, showed Eliza the Swainsons' record. She asked good questions. January 9th, the ferruginous hawk was back. Lily saw her first. She read it slowly. Her throat felt tight in a way she was managing. "My mother kept a journal," Caleb said from across the room. His voice was careful with it. the carefulness of someone picking up something breakable. She kept it her whole life. She said writing things down was how you kept them. Eliza looked up from the book. I didn't keep the journal going after she died, he said. I didn't know how to write the things that happened after that. He looked at the window. This I could do. She looked down at the book again. Entry for January 9th, just days ago. The ferruginous hawk was back. Lily saw her first. Thank you for showing me this, she said. Nodded, still looking at the window. My dad said. He stopped. He said you're staying, that this is your home now, that it's ours. She waited. Is that true? He asked. He turned from the window and looked at her directly, with the full force of his attention, a child asking a real question that he needed a real answer to, and who had learned enough about the world to know the difference between a true answer and a comfortable one. Yes, she said. That's true. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the complete nod she recognized from Holt, the nod that meant a question had been satisfactorily answered, and the conversation on that topic was closed. He held out his hand for the bird book, and she gave it back to him, and he walked past her toward the door. I found a new one last week, he said at the door, in the cottonwoods by the north fence. I think it's a Townsend solitaire, but I'm not certain. I want to go back and look again. Can I come, she said. He looked back at her. The uncertainty in his face shifted, slowly into something that was very close to the expression of a boy who had gotten something he'd wanted badly enough that he'd stopped letting himself want it. Yeah, he said. You can come. Victor Crowley left Cutter's Run in the first week of February. He didn't run. Exactly running would have been beneath him, or at least beneath the image he'd constructed across 30 years of operation. What he did was quieter and more calculated. He arranged the transfer of his land office to a junior partner. He settled several outstanding business matters in a way that suggested a man putting his affairs in order. He was seen at the train station by 3 people who later described the occasion to others, and in all 3 descriptions, he was wearing his good coat and carrying his leather bag, and maintaining the careful composure of a man who had decided that the current situation no longer suited his interests. Formal proceedings against him would take place in Cheyenne, before a territorial judge, with Beaumont's investigation findings as the core of the prosecution's case. Carver and Greer had both agreed to testify. The documentation Eliza had assembled was cited in the filing as the primary evidentiary foundation. Gideon told her this in the records room on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed was a posture he defaulted to when he had something significant to say. Beaumont says the territorial prosecutor is confident, he said. Given Greer's testimony and the paper trail, good, she said. The option agreement will be formally voided. Beaumont expects the court to do that within the month. It's faster than I thought. The judge assigned to the case apparently has a particular dislike for land fraud. He paused. Beaumont also said he stopped. What? He said in 30 years of investigation work, he'd rarely seen documentation as thorough as what you put together. He asked whether you'd considered a career in territorial law. She looked at him. He was doing the almost smile. I told him you were fully employed, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Were you asking him or telling him? He looked at her steadily, in the direct way he had, that he didn't use for everything but used for the things that mattered. Telling him, he said. She nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. He was almost out the door when she said his name, and he turned back. The arrangement, she said carefully. When I came here, the letters were very clear about what it was. Practical. A partnership. I know what I wrote, he said. I'm not sure either of us knew exactly what we were agreeing to, she said. I think that's probably true for both of us. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window of the records room, the February light was doing what February light does in Wyoming, low and pale and honest, without any illusions about warmth. I think you're right, he said. I think we should probably talk about it. We probably should, she said. Tonight, he said. For supper. When the kids are settled. All right, she said. Left. She sat for a moment looking at the space where he'd been standing, and then she looked at the supply orders and the ledger and the neatly organized evidence copies she kept filed, even now that the marshal's office had the originals. She thought about a letter she'd received on a Thursday in March, in a house in Clover Falls, Missouri. The letter that had been written as a joke by a woman who hadn't expected any of it to matter. About all the distance between that Thursday and this Tuesday in February in Wyoming. She picked up her pencil. There was still work to do. Always still work to do. She was exactly the kind of person who did it. And she had made her peace with that a long time ago, though it occurred to her now. sitting in the room that was hers in the house that Gideon had said was theirs, that making peace with something was not the same as knowing its full value. She was beginning to know its full value. Outside, the winter light moved across the Wyoming land with the slow patience of something that had all the time it needed. And inside, the lamp burned on Eliza Whitmore's desk, in the home she had not been looking for and had found anyway, and the work continued. Conversation after supper. That Tuesday happened the way most real conversations happen between people who are not practiced at them slowly, with long pauses, and with both of them saying something slightly different from what they meant until they worked their way to what they actually meant. Lily and Caleb had gone up. The kitchen was the quietest it got, which in a working ranch was still not very quiet. There were sounds from the bunkhouse, wind at the windows, the occasional shift and creak of a house settling into cold. Quiet enough. Gideon made coffee, which was his way of beginning something he needed to be doing something with his hands for. And they sat at the table that had hosted every significant conversation since she'd arrived. He looked at his cup for a moment and then looked at her. "I want to say this right," he said. "So I'm asking you to be patient with me while I work out how." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "When Clara died, my wife, I spent about a year being angry at everything. The land, the weather, cattle, the men, myself. Wasn't good company. I wasn't good for Caleb. Holt kept the ranch running when I couldn't, and I never told him that directly either, which is another conversation I keep meaning to have." He looked at his coffee. "After the anger, I went practical. I thought what I need is a practical arrangement. Someone who can manage the household and help with Caleb and handle the things I don't have time for. No complications. Just function." She waited. "I wrote a practical letter," he said. "Then I got back a practical letter. I thought this is what I asked for. This will work." He paused. "I didn't plan for you." "Didn't plan for Lily either," she said. "No." Something shifted in his face. She has made this house different, in ways I couldn't have anticipated. She and Caleb." He stopped. He hasn't been a boy since his mother died. In a small version of something worn down. And then Lily showed up with her barn cat interrogations and her bird questions and her absolute refusal to accept that he didn't want to be her friend. And he shook his head. Started coming back. "She doesn't force things," Eliza said. "She just shows up consistently until people understand she's not going anywhere." Gideon looked at her. "She learned that from you." She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one. "What I'm trying to say," he said, "is that the practical arrangement stopped being just practical sometime around the third week. I noticed it, and I told myself it was probably gratitude. Counts, the Harmon situation, everything you were doing. I told myself you're a man who's been carrying too much alone, and someone competent showed up, and of course that feels significant." "Oh, was that wrong?" she asked. "Partly," he said. "The competence is real. Everything you've done is real. But that's not," he stopped again. Rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, a gesture she'd seen on him when he was frustrated with his own limitations. "I'm not explaining it well." "You're explaining it fine," she said quietly. He looked at her. "When you left for Laramie, I stood in the kitchen that first morning after you'd gone, and I understood something I hadn't entirely understood before." He held her gaze. "Ranch would have been all right without you finding Carver's file. It would have taken longer and been harder, but Holt and I would have gotten there eventually. What I couldn't figure out was how to be all right without you specifically. And that was different from what I'd told myself the arrangement was." Kitchen clock counted out a stretch of quiet. "The arrangement," Eliza said carefully, "didn't account for what happened between us actually living alongside each other." "No," he said, "it didn't. I wasn't planning for anything either," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I came here because it was the best option available to me and Lily, and because your letters suggested a man who was honest and who would treat my daughter decently. That was what I needed. That was what I was thinking about." She paused. "I wasn't thinking about what it might feel like to watch you carry Lily up the stairs, or what it meant that you went and got oil for my lamp without being asked. I wasn't thinking about any of that. But here we are," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Here we are." She looked at him across the table. He was not a perfect man. He had difficulty saying things he felt. He retreated into work when emotion became too large. He had spent 2 years not fully seeing his own son because grief had narrowed what he was capable of, and he carried the knowledge of that in a way that would probably never entirely leave him. He was stubborn in the particular way of men who have been right often enough to believe they usually are. Gun, he was also, at this moment, sitting in his kitchen at 9 o'clock on a February night, making himself say things that cost him considerably, which was one of the braver things she'd seen anyone do. I'd like it if we talked about what we want this to be, she said. Not the arrangement, what we actually want. He looked at her for a long time. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not as a housekeeper. Not as he stopped. I'd like you and Lily to be here. Properly. I'd like to be the kind of family that Caleb needs and that Lily deserves. I'd like... He stopped again, and then he said it plainly, without the circling. I'd like to be your husband. Actually your husband. Not in the arrangement sense. She held his gaze. She had been sitting with this possibility for weeks, without letting herself think about it too directly. The way you don't look directly at something bright, because looking straight at it changes what you can see. I want that too, she said. The simplicity of it landed in the room and settled. Reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was the most direct thing he'd ever done, that wasn't about feeding livestock or fixing equipment. She turned her hand and held his. And they sat like that for a moment in the kitchen that had become the center of everything, with the February wind outside and the lamp between them and the whole improbable weight of how they'd gotten here. I'm not easy, she said. It needed to be said. I'm going to keep having opinions about the accounts. I'm going to keep staying up too late. I'm going to. Eliza, he said. What? I know who you are. She looked at him. D. He said it the way he said most things that mattered, without decoration, without performance, just with the flat certainty of someone who had been paying attention. All right, she said. He almost smiled, and then all the way. It was the first time she'd seen it go all the way, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought that was probably a thing she was going to spend the rest of her life occasionally thinking about. Spring came to Wyoming with its usual complicated combination of beauty and difficulty, which was how Wyoming generally operated. Snow retreated from the lower pastures in patches, leaving behind the mud that the hands called the second winter because it was almost as much trouble. Cattle moved with renewed energy, and the horses tested fences with the seasonal optimism of animals who had been inside too long. Cottonwoods along the creek put out their first tentative leaves in a green so sharp it almost hurt to look at. Eliza noticed all of it. She had been in Wyoming for 5 months and had developed the habit, without meaning to, of watching the land the way the land required with patience. Gone, and with the understanding that it would show you what you needed to see if you stayed still long enough. Formal proceedings against Victor Crowley took place in Cheyenne in late March, before a territorial judge named Holcomb who had, as Beaumont had indicated, extensive and documented dislike of land fraud. Gideon attended. Eliza stayed at the ranch because someone needed to, and because her documentation had already done the work it needed to do in Beaumont's hands. Gland because she understood, without anyone needing to say it, that her presence in a Cheyenne courtroom would give certain people a story about the case that was not about the evidence. Gideon was gone for 5 days. Caleb managed the shift in household routine with the quiet competence he'd been developing all winter, taking on small responsibilities without being asked in the way that children do when they've decided to be youth and haven't yet thought to make a production of it. Got himself and Lily to breakfast on time. He checked the flour barrel. He reported to Holt each morning in a manner that Holt received with the same flat practicality he applied to everything, which was precisely what Caleb needed. No fuss, no excess acknowledgement. Just one capable person noting that another was doing their part. On the third night, Lily came to find Eliza in the records room. Is it going to be okay? Lily asked. Yes, Eliza said. How do you know? Because we did the work correctly. Because the evidence is what it is, and it doesn't change. She looked at her daughter. Run because Beaumont is good at his job. Lily thought about this. What happens to Mr. Crowley? The court will decide that. The option agreement is void. That's already been formally established. Ranch is safe, regardless of what happens to him personally. Good, Lily said, with a simplicity that made Eliza want to put her arms around her. Are you worried? Eliza asked. Lily considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. I'm not worried about the legal things, she said. I'm worried about when Mr. Blackwood comes home. Whether he'll be the same. What do you mean the same? Lily looked at her hands. Sometimes when things are scary and then they're over, people are different after. Like the scary used them up. Eliza looked at her daughter, this small, serious, unexpectedly wise person who had spent 4 years watching the world very carefully and had drawn conclusions that were more accurate than most adults managed. She thought about where that kind of perception came from. She thought about a little girl whose father had left and who had learned, from that, to read the people who remained. Gideon is a resilient man, Eliza said carefully. He's been through hard things before, and he's still the same person on the other side of them. You're right that hard things change people. They change all of us. She paused. I think the change is usually toward something more real, not less. Lily sat with this. Then she nodded once and went to bed. Gideon came home on a Thursday evening with the particular tiredness of a man who has been sitting in formal proceedings for 5 days and attending to the careful management of his own reactions in rooms full of people watching for weakness. Came through the kitchen door and set his bag down and accepted the cup of coffee Eliza put in front of him and sat for a moment without speaking. Caleb was at the table doing his schoolwork. He looked at his father when he came in, and Gideon looked at him, and something passed between them that Eliza didn't try to interpret because it belonged to them. Gotta go? Caleb asked. Well, Gideon said, did they? Yes. Caleb nodded. He went back to his schoolwork, which was the Blackwood version of a significant emotional response. Lily came in from the sitting room where she'd been reading, looked at Gideon, looked at Eliza, and apparently satisfied herself that the situation was what it appeared to be, because she went back to her book without a word. Gideon caught Eliza's eye over his coffee cup. She could see the tiredness and the relief, and underneath both of them something that was settling, the way ground settles after a long disturbance, finding its new level. Crowley, he said quietly. Tell me when you're ready, she said. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He had 2 more cups before he was ready, which she took to be the requirement of the occasion and treated accordingly. The full accounting came later, after the children were in bed, at the table again, in the way that the table had become the place where the true conversations happened. Dr. Crowley had been found guilty on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit forgery. Sentence included substantial fines and a prohibition on conducting land business in the Wyoming territory for 15 years, which was, as Beaumont had predicted, the form of consequence that would hurt Crowley more than any other. A man like Crowley could survive a fine. What he could not survive was being removed from the operation of the thing that had made him powerful, in the specific geography that had been his territory for 30 years. Galdus Crane had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his full testimony. Joseph Carver had received a formal censure and lost his filing agent license. Miles Greer had been dismissed from the bank, which was severe enough given that he had a family to support, but which the judge had determined was the appropriate consequence for a man who had knowingly participated in fraud, even under duress. How do you feel about Greer? Eliza asked. Gideon thought about it. He was coerced, he said. But he still did it. I can hold both of those things at once. He paused. Family's going to have a hard time. Yes. I don't know what to do about that. She looked at him. You don't have to do anything about it right now. You can sit with it and see what feels right later. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Beaumont mentioned you again. What did he say? He said the documentation you submitted was cited by the judge in the ruling, the foundation of the evidentiary record. He looked at her. He said that without the Laramie trip and the cross-referencing you'd done on the contract signatures, the case would have taken another 8 months to build. If it had been buildable at all. She held his gaze. Judge said it on record, Gideon said. The court transcript will show it. She thought about a porch in Clover Falls, Missouri. She thought about a letter read aloud to a crowd by a man who had expected her to be the end of a joke. She thought about what it meant that her name was now in a territorial court record in Wyoming, cited for the quality of work she had done. She didn't say any of this, but she held it. I'm glad it was enough, she said. It was more than enough. He reached across the table and covered her hand, as he'd done that Tuesday in February, with the same directness that cost him something, and which he'd decided was worth the cost. Save this ranch, Eliza. I want you to know I know that. We saved it, she said. You held it together for 7 years while Crowley was working against you. I just found the right documents at the right time. That's not a small thing. No, she said, but neither is 7 years of holding on. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that had no useful name she'd found, yet the one that she'd started to understand as what Gideon Blackwood looked like when he was allowing himself to feel something fully instead of managing it. Marry me, he said. Actually marry me, not the arrangement. Real thing. She blinked. She hadn't expected him to say it tonight. She'd thought it would come more gradually, as most things came between them worked up to. Approached, arrived it slowly. I have a daughter, she said, which was not what she meant, but was the reflex of a woman who had spent 4 years making sure her daughter's position was accounted for in every situation. I know you have a daughter, he said. I want to marry your daughter's mother. Lily is, he paused, and she could see him working to find the words for something that mattered. Lily is part of this family. She already is. I'm not asking you in spite of that. Lily is one of the reasons. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. He exhaled. She hadn't quite realized until then how much he'd been holding his breath. Good, he said. I'm still going to have opinions about the accounts, she said. I know, and I'm going to keep the records room. I've already accepted that. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the kitchen that had become hers, in the house that had become hers, in the life that had found her when she stopped expecting it to. Yes, she said again, simply, with her whole chest. They were married in June. In the way that frontier marriages happened when done practically a justice of the peace from Cutter's Run, kitchen of Blackwood Creek Ranch. Holt and his wife as witnesses, children present and serious, and in their best clothes. Lily wore a dress that Eliza had made from fabric she'd ordered from the catalog, blue cotton with white at the collar, stood beside Caleb during the short ceremony, with her hands folded and her expression concentrated in the way she brought to all significant occasions. After, Holt shook Gideon's hand for a long time and said nothing, which was Holt's version of a speech. His wife, a practical woman named Ruth, who had been quietly watching Eliza since January, with the assessment of someone determining whether a new person was going to be worth the trouble, hugged Eliza with a firmness that communicated her verdict without words. Caleb gave Eliza something that evening. He came to find her after supper, when the guests had gone and the house had settled back into its own rhythms, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with the bird book in his hand. I want you to have the first section, he said. He'd separated the pages carefully, along the original binding, in the way of someone who had thought about how to do it without damaging either part. The part I started after my mother died. He held it out. She kept records of things. I think it's right for you to have it. Eliza took the pages carefully. She looked at the first entry. November, 2 years before she'd arrived. A short, bleak description of a sparrow hawk on the fence line, written in the handwriting of a boy who was doing the only thing he knew how to do with grief. Thank you, she said. It was completely inadequate and was all she had. He nodded. He looked at his remaining pages, at the entries that started with October of last year when she'd arrived. I'm going to keep going, he said. The new part. I know you are, she said. Went to find Lily. Koo was in the sitting room, and Eliza heard them start talking about the Townsend solitaire they'd gone to look for together in April and found, eventually, in Cottonwoods after 40 minutes of patient waiting. She heard Caleb's voice shift into the register it found when he was talking about something he knew well. She heard Lily's questions. Good ones. Ones that opened things up instead of closing them down. She stood in the kitchen holding the pages of a dead woman's son's grief journal, and she felt the full weight of what had happened over the last 8 months. And it was very heavy. And it was the kind of weight that people are built to carry when it's the right weight. Summer on Blackwood Creek Ranch was a different animal than any other season. And Eliza came to understand it the way she'd come to understand everything about this place gradually, then all at once. Days were long and dry, and full of work that never entirely ended. And the landscape in the summer heat had a particular quality she hadn't seen anywhere else, vast and golden and almost aggressive in its indifference to what the people moving through it needed it to be. She had stopped being frightened by it sometime in May. Now she found it honest. The way she found most things honest that didn't pretend to be gentler than they were. She had taken over the formal management of the ranch's accounts by then, not by announcement but by the natural progression of competence. Holt deferred to her on purchasing questions. Gideon brought her every contract before he signed it, and the men had stopped being surprised to find her at the work table with the ledger and started being surprised when she wasn't. She had reorganized the supplier relationships, established a rotation that reduced their exposure to any single provider, and begun the slow process of building a small reserve fund against the seasonal vulnerabilities that had left them exposed when Crowley was working against them. She was not perfect at any of it. She made mistakes, miscalculated a feed order in July that left them short for 2 weeks, misjudged the cost of a fence repair that came in 30% over her estimate, and had a genuinely difficult disagreement with Gideon in August about the wisdom of purchasing additional grazing land that left both of them stiff-shouldered and uncommunicative for 2 days before Holt told them both plainly that they were being idiots and they should finish the argument and get back to work. They finished the argument. Gideon had been right about the land. She told him so, directly, without qualification. He received this without gloating, which was one of the things about him she had come to value more than most. Caleb turned 8 in July. Lily turned 5 in August. And Eliza made her a cake with the precise proportions of sweetness that Lily preferred, and which required 3 attempts to achieve, because baking at altitude was different from baking in Missouri in ways she was still working out. Third cake was close enough, and Lily declared it excellent, and Caleb ate 2 pieces and said nothing, which she had learned to read as high praise. It was an imperfect summer in a life that was genuinely imperfect. And she was grateful for its imperfections in the specific way you can only be grateful for them when you've spent long enough pretending that everything is fine to understand what it costs. The letter arrived in September from her sister, Margaret. She read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with her coffee, because that was the time of day when she had the house mostly to herself and could react to things privately before deciding how to carry them publicly. The letter was 2 pages, in Margaret's precise handwriting, and it said a number of things in the careful indirect language that Margaret had always used to approach anything difficult. It said that news had reached Clover Falls about the proceedings in Cheyenne, something about the territorial record being publicly accessible had gotten into correspondence, that had gotten into conversation that had eventually gotten back to the Whitmore household. It said that their father was very well. It said their mother's nerves had been calmer recently. It said that Clara had become engaged to a man from St. Louis who was in shipping. Then, at the bottom of the second page, said this: I know I have written everything around what I actually want to say, which is that I am sorry for the letter I wrote in your name and mailed without asking you. I told myself it was a joke, and I think I knew even then that it was something else. I think I was trying to arrange things the way I always try to arrange things, because it is easier than asking people what they want directly. I was wrong to do it, and you built something extraordinary from it, and I'm proud of you, Eliza. I'm very proud of you. We all are, though Father will not write it, and Mother cannot find the words. She read this paragraph 4 times. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with the other letters she kept, and she sat for a moment with her coffee and thought about what she wanted to do with it. She wrote back that afternoon. Letter was shorter than Margaret's. She had never been a long letter writer, and it said the truth, which was that she did not hold the original letter against Margaret, because it had led her here, and here was where she was supposed to be. She had stopped believing in accidents of that size. Said that Lily was well and growing, and completely unmanageable in the most satisfying possible way. Said that she was happy. She paused before she wrote that. She tested the word, the way she tested numbers in the ledger, looking for the error in it, the place where the figure didn't quite add up. She didn't find one. The word was accurate. She wrote it. In October, almost exactly a year after she'd arrived, she went back to the north fence line, where Caleb had first shown her the ferruginous hawk. She went alone in the early morning, before the household woke, in the quiet hour when the sky went from black to deep blue, and the land was still deciding what kind of day it was going to be. She stood at the fence and looked out at the pasture in the cold air, and breathed it in the particular smell of Wyoming in autumn. Dry grass and distance, and something clean and cold underneath everything that she'd never been able to name. The hawk was there. She was on the same fence post she'd been on last year, or one very close to it, sitting with the absolute stillness of a creature that knows exactly what she is and has no anxiety about it. She looked at Eliza from across the pasture with the brilliant, impersonal gaze of a hawk, which does not judge and does not sympathize and does not diminish what it sees. Eliza stood at the fence and looked back. She thought about what it meant to belong to a place. She had grown up in a house that had her family's name on it and had never felt like it belonged to her, because belonging wasn't about names. It was about the particular quality of knowing somewhere deeply enough that you felt the weather before it arrived. It was about the way the morning light moved across familiar ground. It was about the people who expected to find you there and were right. She had not expected to find any of this. She had expected a practical arrangement in a cold territory, and she had expected to be adequate to it, and nothing more. She had not expected Gideon or Caleb or the bird book or the kitchen that became hers or the word home to stop needing a qualifier. She had not expected to find that the woman everyone had called plain and practical and ordinary was, in the geography that suited her, something closer to essential. This was the thing she thought about most, standing at the fence with the hawk across the pasture in the October morning. Not the legal victory, not the Laramie trip, not even the moment in the kitchen in February, when Gideon had reached across the table and she had turned her hand. She thought about the quiet accumulation of days, about the way real things are built not from single dramatic moments, but from the 1,000 unremarkable ones: the flour barrel checked, the lamp refilled, question asked carefully, the silence held long enough for the truth to come through it. She had been useful her whole life and called it enough. She had been practical and capable and unglamorous and called that a self. All of those things were real, were genuinely her, and she did not apologize for them. She understood now that she had also, for a very long time, been telling herself a story about what she deserved, about the scale of life a woman like her was entitled to expect, and that story had been wrong. Did not have to be extraordinary to deserve an extraordinary life. You had to be willing to do the work of it, and to stay when it was hard, and to tell the truth when lying would have been easier. That was enough. That had always been enough. The world just didn't tell you that very often, because a woman who understood her own worth was considerably more difficult to manage than one who didn't. The hawk shifted on the post. She spread her wings once briefly, in the manner of an animal adjusting its position, and then settled again. I know, Eliza said aloud, to the hawk, to the morning, to the accumulated weight of the year. She turned back toward the house. Smoke from the kitchen chimney was already rising when she came across the pasture. Through the kitchen window, she could see the lamp, and the movement of someone inside Gideon, up early, which was not unusual and above, in the second-floor windows. The light in Caleb's room where he woke before dawn on the mornings he had birds to look for, and the dark of Lily's room where her daughter slept with the deep completeness of a child who had decided she was safe. She stopped for a moment at the kitchen door. She was aware, standing there, of what she was about to walk back into. Not a perfect life. She had made her peace with imperfection a long time ago, and she thought imperfect might be the only kind of life worth having, because perfect things didn't require you to be present for them. What she was walking back into was a life that needed her specifically, not because she was the only competent person available. Right. Not because no one else could have done the work, but because she had shown up and stayed and done the particular things that only she knew how to do in the particular ways that had shaped this particular household into the thing it was now. That was what she had built. Not a romance, not a rescue, not a story about a plain woman who turned out to be beautiful in the ways that counted, which was the kind of story people told to make ordinary women feel better about their circumstances without actually changing anything. What she had built was a life, real and complicated and imperfect and fully hers. Pushed open the kitchen door, Gideon turned from the stove, looked at her coat, her boots muddy from the pasture, cold in her face from the morning air, and he said, "Coffee's ready." "Good," she said. "The hawk's back." "Yeah?" He handed her the cup. "Caleb will want to know. I'll tell him when he's up." Took off her coat. She sat at the table. Gideon sat across from her with his own cup, in the way he sat across from her every morning, the way she expected he would sit across from her every morning for a very long time. And outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming October morning was doing what it did, showing up, vast and cold and completely indifferent and absolutely beautiful, requiring nothing of her except that she be here for it. She was here for it. She picked up her cup. Work would begin again in an hour, as it always did, as it would tomorrow and the day after. And she was ready for it, in the way that only people who have found the right work are ready, not with resignation, not with grim determination, but with the quiet, grounded readiness of someone who knows exactly where they are and has decided it's exactly where they mean to be. Gideon looked at her over his cup. She looked back at him. No words necessary for this particular moment, which was one of the gifts of two people who had learned each other well enough to know when language added something and when it only got in the way. Outside, the sun came up over Wyoming. Inside, Eliza Whitmore, Eliza Blackwood drank her coffee and let the morning begin.